Welcome, fellow dreamer. This evening, we're going to explore the ancient Middle East, where humanity's first great civilizations emerged from the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia. From the ingenious Sumerians who gave us writing, to the mighty Persian Empire that stretched across 3 continents, we'll journey through the cradle of civilization where cities, laws, and empires first took shape. Accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, we'll be uncovering little-known wonders and fascinating stories that gently feed your curiosity as you drift towards sleep. And now take a deep breath, let your body sink into comfort, and allow your mind to rest and your eyes to close as the tale unfolds before you. The story of human civilization begins in a place where 2 great rivers carved their way through an ancient landscape, creating a world unlike any other on Earth. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what we now call Iraq, lay a sweep of land that would witness humanity's first steps towards cities, kingdoms, and the complex societies we recognize today. This was Mesopotamia, a name the ancient Greeks would later give it, meaning simply the land between rivers. Picture, if you will, a vast plain stretching away toward distant horizons. The land itself was born from the rivers, built up over countless millennia as sediment washed down from the mountains far to the north. Each spring, when winter snows melted in the highlands of Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, the waters would swell and surge southward, carrying with them the gift of rich, dark soil. This yearly flooding was not always gentle or predictable, but it brought something invaluable, fertility, to an otherwise arid landscape. The Tigris, the more temperamental of the 2 rivers, flowed swift and sometimes fierce, its current strong enough to carve deep channels into the earth. The Euphrates, by contrast, moved more slowly, meandering across the plain in great lazy curves, depositing its load of silt along broad banks. Together, these waterways created an environment of extraordinary contrasts. Where the rivers reached, life flourished. Beyond their influence, the land gradually gave way to steppe and desert, where only the hardiest plants could survive the scorching summers and sparse rainfall. In the northern reaches of this river valley, closer to the mountains, rain fell with enough regularity to support agriculture without extensive irrigation. The rolling plains here turned green each winter and spring, and farmers could rely on the sky as much as the rivers for their water. But as one traveled southward, toward the place where the 2 rivers would eventually merge and empty into the Persian Gulf, the climate grew drier and hotter. Here, the annual rainfall might amount to no more than a few inches, not nearly enough to sustain crops. Yet paradoxically, this southern region would become the heartland of the world's first civilization, precisely because the rivers provided what the sky did not. The land between the rivers was not particularly rich in certain resources that other regions took for granted. Stone suitable for building was scarce on these alluvial plains. Timber of any substantial size was rare, with only date palms and scattered tamarisk and poplar trees breaking the flatness of the landscape. Metal ores were entirely absent. No copper, no tin, no gold or silver could be found in the soil itself. What the land did offer, however, was clay in abundance, and the fertile soil that, when properly watered, could produce harvests of astonishing bounty. The rivers brought more than water and soil. They served as highways for travel and trade, their currents carrying boats laden with goods from one settlement to another. A vessel could drift downstream with relative ease, while the journey upstream required more effort, poles to push against the riverbed in shallow waters, or sails to catch the prevailing winds that often blew from the south. Along the riverbanks, reeds grew in dense stands, providing material for countless purposes that future inhabitants would discover and exploit. The natural environment of Mesopotamia followed rhythms that would profoundly shape the societies that emerged here. Summer brought intense heat, with temperatures that could exceed 120 degrees. The land baked hard, and dust devils danced across the plains. Winter, though mild compared to northern lands, could bring cool winds and occasional frosts. Spring was the season of flooding, when the rivers rose and spread across the floodplain, leaving behind layers of enriching silt. Autumn offered relief from summer's extremes, with warm days and cooler nights. This was a landscape that demanded cooperation from those who would settle here. The flooding, while beneficial, required management. Too much water at the wrong time could devastate crops and settlements. Too little water meant drought and famine. The absence of stone and timber meant that builders would need to develop new techniques, working with the materials at hand. The lack of metal meant that trade networks would need to extend into distant regions, establishing connections with mountain peoples who controlled access to copper and tin. Yet for all its challenges, this land between two rivers offered something precious: the possibility of surplus. When humans learned to channel and control the river waters, directing them through canals and ditches to fields positioned away from the natural watercourses, they could grow more food than they needed for immediate survival. This surplus would become the foundation for everything that followed. Specialized craftspeople who did not need to farm, administrators who could organize labor and resources, artists who could create beauty, and eventually the scribes who would invent writing to keep track of it all. The modern visitor to this region would find it difficult to imagine the verdant fields and thriving settlements that once dotted this landscape. Millennia of changing climate, shifting river courses, and the rise and fall of civilizations have transformed the terrain. The ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf lay much farther north than it does today, and over thousands of years, the rivers have pushed the coastline steadily southward with their constant deposits of sediment. Cities that once stood near the sea now lie far inland, their ruins buried under layers of earth and sand. But in the time before cities, before writing, before the great empires that would rise and fall across these plains, this land between rivers waited, its potential unrealized. The stage was set, the conditions were right, and all that was needed was for humans to discover what could be achieved in this challenging, yet promising environment. The waters flowed as they had for ages, the seasons turned their eternal wheel, and the rich soil lay ready to receive the seeds that would transform human history forever. As we prepare to explore how the first farming communities would take root in this landscape, we leave behind the empty plains and meandering rivers of prehistoric times, and turn our attention to the moment when people chose to stop wandering and make this fertile but demanding land their permanent home. The fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates had witnessed countless seasons pass, each flood and drought etching patterns into the landscape. Yet something remarkable was beginning to unfold across these ancient lands, a transformation so profound that it would reshape the very nature of human existence. The people who had long wandered these territories, following game and gathering wild seeds, were about to discover something extraordinary. They could stay in one place. Around 10,000 years before the Common Era, in the foothills and plains of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, small groups of people began to notice patterns in the plants they gathered. Wild wheat and barley grew in dense stands, their golden heads heavy with nutritious grain. Generation after generation had collected these seeds, but now some observant souls recognized that the seeds themselves held a secret. When they fell to the ground in autumn, new plants sprouted with the winter rains. What if these seeds could be deliberately planted? The transition was gradual, unfolding over centuries rather than years. These early experimenters began scattering seeds near their seasonal camps, returning months later to find plants waiting for harvest. The wild grains they worked with were the ancestors of modern wheat and barley, though their kernels were smaller and their husks more difficult to remove. Through patient observation and countless seasons of trial, these ancient farmers learned which seeds produced the best plants, unknowingly beginning the long process of domestication. As communities began to rely more heavily on cultivated crops, the logic of settlement became compelling. Why wander far from fields that required tending? The plants needed protection from animals and birds. They needed water during dry spells, and when harvest time arrived, the grain needed to be processed and stored. Gradually, temporary camps became seasonal villages, and seasonal villages became permanent homes. Among the earliest of these settled communities was Jarmo, nestled in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in what is now northern Iraq. Archaeological evidence suggests that people lived there around 7,000 years before the Common Era. The inhabitants of Jarmo built simple houses from packed mud, creating rectangular rooms that clustered together. They cultivated wheat and barley in nearby fields, grinding the grain between stones to make flour. In their refuse heaps, archaeologists have found the remains of domesticated goats and sheep, evidence that the agricultural revolution extended beyond plants to animals as well. The people of Jarmo crafted tools from stone and bone, creating sickle blades to harvest their grain and grinding stones to process it. They shaped clay into simple vessels for storage, though the earliest pottery was crude and fragile. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, suggesting beliefs about the connection between the living and those who had passed on, between the present and the ancestral past. Further to the west, in the region of modern-day Turkey, another remarkable settlement emerged. Though not technically within Mesopotamia proper, Çatalhöyük represents a crucial chapter in this story of early settlement. This community, thriving around the same period, housed perhaps several thousand people at its peak. The houses were built so close together that residents entered through openings in their roofs, climbing down ladders into their homes. The walls of these dwellings were sometimes decorated with paintings and reliefs, showing scenes of hunting and geometric patterns that hint at the symbolic thinking of these early farmers. The challenge of water shaped every aspect of early agricultural life in Mesopotamia. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes too much, sometimes too little. The spring floods came after the growing season when they were less useful for crops. Rainfall alone was insufficient in the southern plains. The solution required innovation and cooperation: irrigation. The earliest irrigation systems were simple affairs. Farmers dug shallow channels to direct water from rivers and streams to their fields. They constructed small dams and levees to control flooding. These projects demanded coordination among neighboring families and eventually entire communities. A breach in one family's channel could flood another's field. The timing of water distribution needed agreement and fairness. Through these practical necessities, the seeds of more complex social organization were planted alongside the wheat and barley. As agriculture became more reliable, populations grew, villages expanded, and new settlements appeared across the landscape. Surplus grain could be stored in clay vessels and bins, providing security against future shortages. This surplus created something unprecedented in human history. Not everyone needed to be directly involved in food production. Some individuals could specialize in crafting better tools, making pottery, or weaving textiles from flax and wool. The domestication of animals proceeded alongside plant cultivation. Wild sheep and goats, initially hunted for meat, became herded and bred for desirable traits. Cattle, descendants of the mighty aurochs, were gradually tamed. These animals provided not only meat, but also milk, leather, and wool. Later, they would pull plows and carts, multiplying human labor's effectiveness. Pigs rooted around settlements, consuming refuse. Each species required different knowledge and care, adding to the growing complexity of agricultural life. The settled life brought new challenges. Diseases spread more easily in permanent communities where people lived in close proximity. Storage attracted rodents and insects. Disputes arose over land and water rights. Yet the advantages outweighed these difficulties. Children could be raised in stable environments. The elderly, no longer required to keep pace with wandering bands, could remain with their families. Knowledge could accumulate in one place, building from generation to generation. In these early farming communities, the rhythms of life aligned with the agricultural calendar. Plowing and planting, tending and weeding, harvesting and storing, each season brought its tasks and concerns. Between these demanding periods came time for other activities, improving homes, crafting tools, perhaps gathering to share stories and mark important events. The material culture of these early settlements was still simple by later standards. Tools remained primarily stone, bone, and wood. Pottery improved gradually, becoming more refined and decorated. Textiles appeared as people learned to spin and weave plant fibers and animal wool. Jewelry fashioned from shells, stones, and bones suggests attention to personal adornment and perhaps social distinction. These scattered farming villages, each home to dozens or perhaps a few hundred people, had no writing to record their stories, no monumental architecture to proclaim their achievements. Yet their quiet revolution was changing everything. They were learning to reshape their environment deliberately, to plan for future seasons, to accumulate and store resources. They were developing the skills, technologies, and social patterns that would make possible everything that followed. As generations passed in these early settlements, the population of Mesopotamia grew. More land came under cultivation. Villages multiplied. The irrigation systems became more elaborate and extensive. The stage was being set for something unprecedented, a concentration of people and resources that would give birth to humanity's first true cities, places where thousands would live together, where new forms of social organization would emerge, and where the next great transformations would unfold. The settlements scattered across the Mesopotamian plain had grown steadily over generations. Their mud brick homes clustered together in patterns that spoke of community and cooperation. But as the fourth millennium before the Common Era unfolded, something remarkable began to happen along the banks of the Euphrates River. A transformation was taking place that would forever change the course of human civilization. In a location that would come to be known as Uruk, people were gathering in numbers never before seen in human history. What had once been a modest farming community was expanding at an extraordinary pace, drawing people from the surrounding countryside like a great lodestone pulling metal filings toward its center. By around 4,000 years before the Common Era, Uruk had grown into something entirely new, something the world had never witnessed. It had become a city. The scale of Uruk was breathtaking for its time. While previous settlements might house a few hundred souls, Uruk swelled to accommodate tens of thousands of inhabitants within its bounds. The city eventually sprawled across nearly 1,500 acres, enclosed by massive walls that stretched for nearly 6 miles. These weren't the simple mud brick boundaries of a farming village. These were monumental constructions, wide enough in places for chariots to drive along their tops, high enough to inspire awe in any traveler approaching from the flat plains beyond. Walking through Uruk in those early centuries of urban life would have been an experience unlike any before in human existence. The narrow streets wound between buildings that rose 2 and sometimes 3 stories high, their walls plastered and often decorated with colored patterns. The air would have been filled with sounds that marked this new way of living: the ring of metal on metal from workshops, the calls of merchants trading goods, the bleating of livestock being herded through designated pathways, and the constant murmur of thousands of human voices engaged in countless conversations. The heart of Uruk was dominated by 2 great temple complexes that rose above the ordinary structures like mountains emerging from a plain. The Ina district, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, featured elaborate buildings constructed on platforms that lifted them above the common ground. The Anu district, honoring the sky god, displayed similar architectural ambition. These weren't merely places of worship. They were centers of community organization, economic management, and artistic achievement. The temples of Uruk pioneered architectural techniques that would influence building practices for millennia to come. Workers had discovered that by creating cone-shaped pieces of clay with colored ends and pressing them into wet plaster, they could create elaborate mosaic patterns on walls and columns. These decorations transformed functional structures into works of art, their geometric designs catching the light in ways that must have seemed almost magical to people accustomed to plain mud brick. What made Uruk truly revolutionary, however, wasn't merely its size or its impressive buildings. It was the way people organized themselves within its walls. In earlier farming villages, most people did similar work. They farmed, they tended animals, they made basic tools and pottery for their own use. But Uruk's population was too large and too concentrated to sustain itself through traditional village patterns. A new system emerged, one based on specialized labor. For the first time in history, significant numbers of people devoted themselves entirely to specific crafts and professions. Some became full-time potters, developing techniques that allowed them to produce vessels of unprecedented quality and quantity. Others specialized in metalworking, creating tools and decorative objects from copper and eventually bronze. Weavers produced textiles that became valuable trade goods. Carpenters, stonemasons, and bricklayers honed their skills to levels impossible when such work was merely one task among many. This specialization created a web of interdependence that defined urban life. A potter who spent their days at the wheel no longer had time to grow grain or tend livestock. They relied on farmers to provide food, which they acquired through exchange. Similarly, farmers began to depend on specialized craftspeople for tools, storage vessels, and other goods they once made themselves. The temple complexes played a crucial role in managing these exchanges, receiving goods from various workers and redistributing them according to need and status. The concentration of people in Uruk also demanded new approaches to obtaining resources. The Mesopotamian plain, while rich in fertile soil and blessed with water, lacked many materials essential to an advancing society. There was no good stone for building or tool making, no metal ores, and little timber suitable for construction. The solution lay in reaching outward, establishing trade networks that extended across remarkable distances. Uruk's traders ventured far beyond the familiar plains, traveling north into the mountains of Anatolia in search of metals and timber, south to the Persian Gulf, where they could acquire exotic goods brought by sea, and east toward the highlands of Iran, where valuable stones could be obtained. These trading expeditions required organization, planning, and record-keeping far beyond what village life had ever demanded. Someone needed to track what goods left Uruk, what came back, who owed what to whom, and how resources should be distributed. The complexity of managing a city of this size also gave rise to social hierarchies more pronounced than anything seen before. While earlier communities certainly had leaders and differences in status, Uruk developed distinct social classes. At the top sat a ruling elite, possibly headed by a figure who combined religious and political authority. Below them were the specialized craftspeople, merchants, and administrators who kept the city functioning. Farmers who worked the fields surrounding the city occupied another tier, while those who performed basic labor likely formed the largest group. Evidence from Uruk shows that some individuals enjoyed considerably more wealth and comfort than others. Certain houses were larger and better appointed, their owners buried with valuable goods that speak of accumulated prosperity. The organization required to coordinate thousands of people living in close proximity also meant that some individuals held power over others, making decisions that affected entire communities within the city's walls. Yet for all the challenges and inequalities that urban life introduced, Uruk's growth suggests that many people found advantages in city dwelling. The concentration of craftspeople meant access to goods of higher quality than isolated families could produce. The walls offered protection from raiders and rival groups. The temples provided not only spiritual comfort, but practical support during difficult times, maintaining stores that could help residents survive poor harvests or other disasters. As evening fell over Uruk, when the work of the day concluded and people retreated to their homes, the city must have presented an extraordinary sight. Thousands of cooking fires would have lit the gathering darkness, their smoke rising into the sky in countless thin columns. The great temple platforms would have loomed as dark shapes against the stars, occasionally lit by torches that marked ongoing ceremonies or nighttime activities. Uruk had accomplished something profound. It had demonstrated that humans could live together in numbers previously unimaginable, organizing themselves in ways that allowed specialized knowledge to flourish and communal projects of enormous scale to be completed. The city stood as proof that human society could be structured in entirely new ways, that villages weren't the final form of human settlement, but merely one step on a longer journey. The innovations pioneered in Uruk would spread to other communities across Mesopotamia and beyond. But before those ideas could travel effectively, before the complexity of urban life could be fully managed and expanded, humanity needed one more breakthrough. The elaborate systems of trade, the specialized labor, and the social hierarchies all created a pressing need that earlier, simpler societies had never faced. They needed a way to record information that would last beyond individual memory, a method to preserve knowledge and transactions for future reference. That need would soon drive the people of Mesopotamia toward perhaps their greatest invention of all. As the great city of Uruk flourished along the banks of the Euphrates, its temples rising toward the heavens and its population swelling beyond anything the world had known, a remarkable transformation was beginning to take place. In the cool, shadowed corners of temple complexes, men sat cross-legged before clay tablets, their reed styluses moving with careful deliberation across the soft surface. They were creating something entirely new, something that would outlast every building, every king, every empire that would rise and fall across the ancient world. They were capturing human thought in physical form, preserving it for eternity. The invention of writing did not arrive as a sudden revelation, no single moment of inspiration that changed everything in an instant. Instead, it emerged gradually, almost hesitantly, born from the practical needs of an increasingly complex society. As Uruk grew, so too did the challenges of managing its wealth and resources. Temple administrators needed to track grain deliveries from distant fields, record the distribution of barley rations to workers, monitor the herds of sheep and cattle that belonged to the gods. Memory alone could no longer suffice when thousands of transactions occurred each season. The earliest attempts at record-keeping were beautifully simple. Temple officials used small clay tokens, each one shaped to represent a specific commodity. A cone-shaped token might represent a measure of grain, while a disc could stand for a sheep and a cylinder for a jar of oil. These humble tokens, no larger than a finger's breadth, could be gathered together and sealed within hollow clay spheres called bulli, creating a permanent record of a transaction. Yet as the economy expanded, even this system proved insufficient. The variety of goods multiplied, the numbers grew larger, and the clay balls became unwieldy. Around 3,200 years before the Common Era, someone in Sumer conceived of an elegant solution. Rather than sealing tokens inside clay, why not simply press them into the surface of a flat tablet, leaving their impressions behind? The three-dimensional tokens could be replaced by two-dimensional images, marks on clay that could be dried and stored indefinitely. At first, these marks were pictographs, simple drawings that represented the objects they depicted. A star-shaped symbol might represent the heavens or a deity, while a head with a mouth emphasized meant to eat. The symbol for an ox's head stood for cattle, and a triangular shape with a divided interior represented a woman. These early tablets are mesmerizing to contemplate, bridges between the world of images and the world of abstract symbols. They contain within them the seed of literacy, though they were not yet true writing in the fullest sense. They could record what and how much, but they could not yet capture the nuances of language itself, the verbs and grammatical structures that give expression to complex thought. A pictograph could show that 5 jars of oil had been delivered, but it could not explain why or under what circumstances, or what the delivery might mean for future plans. The evolution continued, driven by necessity and human ingenuity. Over generations, the pictographs became increasingly stylized and abstract. The scribes discovered that drawing curved lines in wet clay was difficult and time-consuming. The reed stylus cut at an angle naturally created wedge-shaped marks when pressed into the clay surface. These wedge marks, which we now call cuneiform from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, proved far more efficient than attempting to draw elaborate pictures. The image of a head gradually transformed into a combination of wedge marks that bore little visual resemblance to its original inspiration. Writing was becoming a code, a system of arbitrary symbols that required training to interpret. With this abstraction came possibility. The scribes began to employ the rebus principle, using symbols not just for the objects they depicted, but for the sounds those words made when spoken. A symbol that originally meant water could now also represent the sound of the word for water, and that sound could be combined with other sounds to create entirely new words. This was a conceptual leap of extraordinary significance. Writing was no longer bound solely to concrete objects. It could now represent language itself, with all its flexibility and expressive power. The scribes who mastered this emerging technology occupied a privileged position in Sumerian society. Becoming literate required years of dedicated study, beginning in childhood. Young boys, for the profession was almost exclusively male, would enter the edubba, the tablet house, where they would spend countless hours copying signs, memorizing the hundreds of symbols and their multiple meanings, practicing until their hands could form the wedges with confident precision. They learned on practice tablets that could be smoothed over and reused, working through lexical lists that organized the written signs, grouping them by category or sound. The discipline was exacting, the expectations high. Texts that have survived from these ancient schools reveal a strict environment where errors met with correction and masters demanded perfection. Yet those who completed their training entered a world of opportunity. Literate scribes were essential to temple administration, to the palace bureaucracy, to long-distance trade. They could find employment recording legal contracts, documenting property sales, maintaining records of loans and debts, corresponding with distant cities. Literacy was power, and those who possessed it guarded their knowledge carefully. The scope of cuneiform writing expanded remarkably over the centuries following its invention. What began as a tool for accounting gradually encompassed every domain of human experience. Scribes recorded laws and royal decrees, preserving the decisions of kings for future generations. They copied out religious hymns and incantations, the sacred words that honored the gods and protected against evil. They set down medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, mathematical problems exploring the relationships between numbers, astronomical observations tracking the movements of celestial bodies across the night sky. Literature, too, found its expression in cuneiform. Myths that had circulated orally for generations were finally written down, their narratives preserved in permanent form. Scribes recorded the deeds of legendary heroes, the love songs sung at festivals, the lamentations mourned when cities fell to enemies. Wisdom literature collected proverbs and advice for living well. Personal letters revealed the concerns of ordinary people, their business dealings and family relationships, their hopes and anxieties rendered visible across millennia. The physical act of creating these tablets connected the scribe intimately with his work. Clay had to be prepared to just the right consistency, neither too wet nor too dry. The stylus required a practiced hand to create marks of uniform depth and clarity. Once inscribed, tablets were left to dry in the sun or for particularly important documents, baked in a kiln to ensure their survival. Some tablets were small enough to hold in one palm, containing perhaps a simple receipt or short message. Others were large, multi-columned tablets documenting complex transactions or lengthy literary compositions. The largest could measure nearly a foot in length, their surfaces covered with hundreds of tiny wedge marks arranged in neat columns. As writing spread beyond the walls of Uruk to other Sumerian cities, and eventually to peoples throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, it underwent continuous refinement and adaptation. Different scribal traditions emerged, regional variations in sign forms developed, and the cuneiform system proved remarkably flexible in representing languages quite different from Sumerian. The impact on human civilization was profound and irreversible. Knowledge could now accumulate across generations, each age building upon the discoveries and insights of those who came before. Agreements could be recorded and verified, reducing disputes. History itself became possible as the deeds of rulers and the fates of cities were chronicled for posterity. In those quiet rooms where scribes bent over their tablets, working by the light filtering through high windows, humanity was being transformed in ways that would echo through all the centuries to come. The invention of writing had opened new possibilities for the people of southern Mesopotamia, but the daily rhythms of life in the Sumerian city-states remained intimately connected to the earth, the seasons, and the eternal flow of the rivers. As the fourth millennium gave way to the third, the landscape between the Tigris and Euphrates became dotted with independent cities, each rising from the flat alluvial plain like islands of human ambition in a sea of cultivated fields. These city-states shared a common culture and language, yet each maintained its own identity its own patron deity, and its own political independence. Ur stood near the southern marshlands, its people skilled in fishing and the weaving of reeds. Lagash controlled fertile agricultural lands, its farmers coaxing abundant harvests from carefully maintained irrigation channels. Nippur held a special place in the Sumerian world as a religious center, home to the temple of Enlil, the god of wind and storm. Other cities like Uruk, Umma, Kish, and Eridu each occupied their own territory, and while they traded with one another and shared cultural traditions, they remained fiercely independent, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing for resources and prestige. The most striking feature of any Sumerian city was undoubtedly its ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid rising from the urban center. These were not burial monuments like the pyramids that would later appear in Egypt, but rather elevated platforms designed to bring Earth closer to heaven. Built from millions of mud bricks dried in the intense Mesopotamian sun, these structures required enormous investments of labor and resources. The ziggurat served as the earthly home of the city's patron god, a meeting place between the divine and human realms. At its summit stood a temple, accessible by long staircases, where priests performed rituals and maintained the presence of the deity who protected and sustained the city. Around the base of the ziggurat sprawled the temple complex, a vast economic institution that owned much of the surrounding farmland. Here, in courtyards and storage rooms, the wealth of the city accumulated. Clay tablets recorded the temple's extensive holdings: fields of barley and wheat, date palm groves, flocks of sheep and goats, workshops where craftsmen produced textiles and pottery. The temple employed a significant portion of the city's population, distributing rations of grain and oil in exchange for labor. In this way, the temple functioned not merely as a place of worship, but as the organizational heart of the entire community. Beyond the sacred precinct, the city spread outward in a maze of narrow streets and alleys. Most people lived in modest homes built from the same sun-dried mud bricks that formed the ziggurat. These houses typically consisted of several rooms arranged around a small central courtyard, open to the sky. The courtyard provided light and air in the warm climate, and here families might keep a cooking area or a small space for craft work. The walls were thick, helping to keep interiors cool during the blazing summer days when temperatures could become oppressive. In the evening, families might climb to the flat roofs to catch whatever breeze stirred across the city and to sleep under the vast canopy of stars. The daily life of a Sumerian farmer followed patterns established over countless generations. He rose before dawn and made his way to the fields that lay beyond the city walls, walking along irrigation channels that brought water from the rivers to the thirsty soil. The agricultural year revolved around the flooding of the rivers and the need to harness their waters. In spring, when snowmelt from distant mountains swelled the Tigris and Euphrates, farmers worked to direct water into their fields, using simple tools to breach and repair earthen banks. They grew barley as their primary crop, along with wheat, lentils, and chickpeas. Date palms provided sweet fruit and shade, and their fronds served 1,000 purposes, from roofing material to basket weaving. The work was demanding but rhythmic. Plowing, sowing, irrigating, weeding, and finally harvesting filled the calendar in predictable succession. Farmers used wooden plows pulled by oxen, and they understood that the fertility of their fields depended on careful management of water and the buildup of salts that could render soil barren if irrigation was poorly managed. After harvest, a portion of the crop went to the temple as an offering to the gods and as payment for the use of temple-owned land. Another portion was set aside as seed for the next planting. What remained fed the farmer's family through the year. Artisans and craftspeople formed another essential layer of Sumerian society. Potters shaped clay vessels on wheels, creating storage jars, serving bowls, and specialized containers for every purpose. The potter's wheel itself was a remarkable innovation, allowing for the rapid production of symmetrical vessels that could be decorated with geometric patterns or scenes of daily life before being fired in kilns. Weavers worked with wool from the temple flocks, creating textiles that ranged from coarse fabric for everyday wear to fine cloth suitable for the garments of priests and wealthy merchants. The art of weaving required skill and patience, as threads were spun by hand and then interlaced on upright looms. Metalworkers commanded special respect for their ability to transform raw materials through fire. They worked copper, which could be hammered into tools, weapons, and decorative objects. Some had begun to experiment with mixing copper and tin to create bronze, a harder alloy that would eventually give its name to an entire age of human development. The sources of metal lay far from Sumer, in the mountains to the north and east, making metalworking dependent on long-distance trade networks that connected the cities of the plain to distant regions. Merchants facilitated these trade connections, traveling by donkey caravan or riverboat to acquire materials unavailable in the alluvial lowlands. They brought timber from forested highlands, stone for building and sculpture, precious metals, and semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan. In exchange, they offered Sumerian grain, textiles, and manufactured goods. Some merchants grew wealthy from this trade, building substantial houses and becoming influential figures in their cities. The streets of a Sumerian city hummed with activity during daylight hours. In the marketplace, vendors offered goods while buyers examined quality and negotiated prices, their transactions sometimes recorded by scribes on clay tablets. Children played in the narrow lanes, and women carried water from communal wells or the river. The sounds of hammering came from workshops where craftsmen pursued their trades, and the aroma of baking bread drifted from household ovens. Donkeys bearing loads picked their way through the crowds, their drivers calling out warnings. Despite the absence of a centralized state controlling all of Sumer, these city-states developed sophisticated social structures. At the top stood the ruler, sometimes called an ensi or lugal, who served as both political leader and chief representative to the city's patron deity. Priests formed an influential class, managing temple properties and performing rituals essential to maintaining cosmic order. Scribes, with their specialized knowledge of writing, occupied positions of respect and authority. Below them came the broad mass of farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, whose work sustained the entire system. Life in these ancient cities flowed according to rhythms both human and divine, shaped by the seasons, the rivers, and the understanding that the gods watched over all human endeavors. As the sun set over the Sumerian plain, casting long shadows from the ziggurats, farmers returned from their fields, merchants tallied the day's transactions, and families gathered in their courtyards. The stars emerged, those same celestial markers that priests observed and recorded, seeking to understand the intentions of the gods and the patterns that governed existence. In this world of city-states, where urban life and agricultural tradition intertwined, the foundations of civilization continued to develop, one sun-dried brick, one clay tablet, one carefully irrigated field at a time. The people of ancient Sumer looked up at the night sky and saw not merely stars, but the dwelling places of the gods. In their understanding of the universe, the heavens and earth were intimately connected, and divine beings controlled every aspect of existence, from the flooding of rivers to the growth of grain in the fields. This worldview shaped every moment of daily life in the city-states along the Tigris and Euphrates, creating a civilization where the sacred and the mundane were inseparably woven together. At the very top of the Sumerian pantheon stood En, whose name meant simply heaven in their language. He was the father of the gods, dwelling in the highest realm of the cosmos. Yet despite his supreme position, En had become somewhat distant from daily affairs, allowing other deities to take more active roles in the world of humans. Among these was Enlil, the god of wind and storms, who held tremendous power over the atmosphere and was considered the king of the gods in practical terms. It was Enlil who had separated heaven from earth in the ancient times, creating the space where human civilization could flourish. The goddess Inanna held a special place in Sumerian hearts. Known for her association with love, beauty, and warfare, she embodied the contradictions and complexities of life itself. Her stories were told and retold in the city squares and temple courtyards, tales of her descent to the underworld and her passionate relationships with mortal kings. The people saw in Inanna both the nurturing aspects of feminine divinity and its fierce, untamed power. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, dwelt in the sweet underground waters called the Abzu. He was the patron of craftsmen and scribes, the one who had organized the world and given humanity the gifts of civilization. In the Sumerian understanding, Enki had taught humans the arts of building, farming, and writing. The priests recounted how this clever god had saved humanity from a great flood sent by other deities, warning one faithful man to build a boat and preserve life on Earth. The Sumerians believed that humans had been created for a specific purpose, to serve the gods by providing them with food, drink, and shelter. This was not seen as a burden, but as humanity's sacred duty and the very reason for existence. The gods required sustenance just as mortals did, though they consumed the spiritual essence of offerings rather than the physical substances themselves. Through proper ritual and sacrifice, humans maintained the cosmic order and ensured the gods' continued favor. Each city-state had its own patron deity who was believed to own the city and its surrounding lands. In Uruk, Inanna was the divine ruler. In Nippur, Enlil held sway. The city of Eridu belonged to Enki. This divine ownership meant that the temple was not merely a place of worship, but the very household of the god, and the priests were the god's servants and stewards of divine property. These temples rose above the flat Mesopotamian plain as magnificent ziggurats, stepped pyramids of mud brick that reached toward the heavens. The ziggurat was not itself the temple, but rather the platform upon which the temple stood, creating a meeting point between earth and sky. Worshippers would climb the long staircases that ascended the ziggurat's sides, moving upward through different levels of sacred space until they reached the small shrine at the summit where the deity was believed to dwell. The temple complexes sprawled across large areas of the city, encompassing not only the ziggurat and shrine, but also courtyards, workshops, granaries, and administrative buildings. These were bustling centers of economic activity, where priests managed vast agricultural estates, collected taxes and offerings, and distributed rations to temple workers. Thousands of people might be employed by a single temple, including farmers who worked the gods' fields, weavers who created textiles, brewers who made beer for offerings and rations, and scribes who recorded every transaction in careful cuneiform script. The high priest, known as the Ensi or sometimes as the Lugal, served as the intermediary between the deity and the human community. This was a position of tremendous responsibility and power, for the priest spoke with the god's authority and managed the god's earthly possessions. In some cities, the Ensi was also the political ruler, making no distinction between religious and secular authority. In others, these roles were divided, but the priesthood always wielded significant influence over civic affairs. Daily rituals structured the temple's rhythm just as the seasons structured the agricultural year. Each morning, priests would awaken the god's statue with hymns and music, wash and dress the divine image in fresh garments, and present offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit. These rituals were performed with meticulous care, for any error might offend the deity and bring misfortune upon the entire city. At night, the god was put to rest with similar ceremony, the statue carefully laid in its sacred bed chamber. The Sumerians celebrated numerous festivals throughout the year, marking the changing seasons and important moments in the mythological calendar. During these celebrations, the god's statue might be carried through the city streets in grand procession, allowing all the people to see their divine patron. Music filled the air as musicians played lyres, harps, and drums. Singers chanted ancient hymns passed down through generations. People would bring their own offerings, hopeful for blessings of health, prosperity, and children. The New Year festival held particular significance as it celebrated the renewal of the world and the reaffirmation of the cosmic order. During this time, the king or high priest might perform a sacred marriage ritual, representing the union of the deity with the land itself. This ceremony was believed to ensure fertility for the coming year, bringing abundant harvests and prosperity to the city-state. Common people approached the gods with both reverence and a sense of personal relationship. They might leave small votive offerings at temples, tiny statues representing themselves in eternal prayer before the deity. Clay plaques showing scenes of worship have been found in homes, suggesting that private devotion complemented public ritual. People called upon the gods in times of trouble, seeking healing from illness, protection from enemies, or justice in disputes. Yet the Sumerian relationship with the divine was not one of simple confidence. Their religious texts reveal an awareness that the god's will was often mysterious and their favor uncertain. The deities might punish cities for reasons humans could not fully comprehend. Demons and evil spirits lurked in the world, requiring protective amulets and incantations. Life was fragile, and even with proper devotion, misfortune could strike. As the darkness of evening settles over our own world, we might imagine the ancient Sumerians performing their sunset rituals, offering prayers of thanksgiving for another day's sustenance, asking protection through the night. In their temples, priests tended the eternal flames. In their homes, families invoked the household spirits. The same stars that wheel above us now look down upon those ancient people who saw in the heavens not emptiness, but the homes of the gods, watching over humanity in the land between two rivers. The landscape of Mesopotamia had long been divided among fiercely independent city-states, each with its own patron deity, its own royal family, and its own ambitions. The temples rose high above the plains, and the kings of Lagash, Uruk, and Nippur each proclaimed their own divine mandates. Trade flowed between these cities, yes, and they shared a common cultural heritage, but they also competed, quarreled, and sometimes went to war over boundary stones and irrigation rights. The idea that all these proud cities might bow to a single ruler seemed as distant as the stars that the priests charted from their ziggurats. Yet around the year 2334 BCE, a transformation began that would reshape the entire region. In the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, where Sumerian influence blended with the cultures of Semitic-speaking peoples, a man named Sargon emerged from obscurity to claim power in a city called Akkad. The exact location of Akkad itself remains one of archaeology's tantalizing mysteries. as the city has never been definitively identified, though it likely stood somewhere along the Euphrates in the region between later Babylon and Baghdad. What is not mysterious, however, is the profound impact this city and its ruler would have on human history. Sargon's origins became the subject of legend even in ancient times. Later texts described him as a foundling, discovered in a reed basket floating on the river, raised by a gardener and favored by the goddess Ishtar. Whether these tales contain kernels of truth or represent the kind of mythologizing that often surrounds great rulers, we cannot say with certainty. What we do know is that Sargon rose to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, a position of considerable trust and proximity to power. From this position, through means not entirely clear to us across the millennia, he seized control and embarked on an unprecedented campaign of conquest. Unlike previous conflicts between Mesopotamian cities, which typically involved one city-state temporarily dominating its neighbors before the balance of power shifted again, Sargon pursued a different vision. Moving southward, he defeated the armies of the Sumerian cities one by one. Uruk fell, then then Lagash, where previous conquerors might have installed puppet rulers or extracted tribute before withdrawing. Sargon incorporated these cities directly into his realm, creating something the world had not seen before, a true territorial empire spanning multiple cities and peoples. The empire Sargon built stretched from the Persian Gulf northward to the Mediterranean coast, encompassing the diverse landscapes and peoples of Mesopotamia and beyond. For the first time, a single administration governed both the Sumerian south and the Akkadian north, along with territories in what are now Syria and parts of Iran. This vast domain required innovations in governance, communication, and cultural integration that would influence imperial systems for centuries to come. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue distinct from the Sumerian language isolate, became the lingua franca of this new empire. Yet Sargon and his successors showed remarkable sophistication in their approach to cultural matters. Rather than attempting to erase Sumerian traditions, they embraced them. Akkadian rulers continued to honor the Sumerian gods, maintained the temples, and even composed inscriptions in both languages. Scribes in the great cities now trained in both Sumerian and Akkadian, and the cuneiform writing system proved flexible enough to represent both languages, though they were structurally quite different. This cultural blending produced a rich synthesis. Akkadian poets retold Sumerian myths, adapting them to their own language while preserving their essential character. The goddess Inanna became identified with Ishtar, Enki with E, but the stories and rituals continued. Administrative texts from Akkadian archives show Sumerian titles and terminology coexisting with Akkadian innovations. The empire became a crucible in which different traditions melted and mingled, creating new alloys while preserving distinct elements of each original culture. Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, provides a fascinating glimpse into this cultural synthesis. He appointed her as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at a position of tremendous religious and political significance. But Enheduanna was more than a figurehead. She composed hymns and religious poetry in Sumerian, works of such power and beauty that they were copied and studied for centuries after her death. She is the first author in human history whose name we know with certainty, and her writings reveal a sophisticated mind navigating the complex religious and political landscape of the early empire. The administrative innovations of the Akkadian period laid foundations for future empires. Sargon and his successors appointed governors to oversee distant provinces, established standardized systems for taxation and tribute, and created networks of communication that allowed directives from the capital to to reach the empire's furthest corners. Soldiers garrisoned strategic cities, and officials loyal to the king replaced local dynasties. The bureaucracy expanded, and with it, the demand for scribes who could manage the increasingly complex records of an empire's affairs. Trade flourished under Akkadian rule as never before. With much of the region under unified control, merchants could travel greater distances with less risk. Akkadian commercial networks reached into Anatolia for metals, to the Iranian plateau for precious stones, and across the Persian Gulf for exotic goods from distant lands. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian period, used to mark documents and containers, have been found across this vast trading sphere, testimony to the reach of Akkadian influence. The Akkadian Empire endured for approximately a century and a half, spanning the reigns of Sargon and his successors. His grandson Naram-Sin took the audacious step of declaring himself a god during his lifetime, having his name written with the divine determinative sign and constructing temples to his own worship. Magnificent victory steels celebrated Akkadian military triumphs, depicting kings trampling enemies underfoot and ascending mountains to receive divine favor. The confidence and ambition of this period shine through in these monuments, preserved now in museums, silent witnesses to vanished glory. Yet empires, however mighty, face challenges both external and internal. The later Akkadian kings confronted rebellions in the south, where Sumerian cities chafed under foreign rule. Raids by peoples from the Zagros Mountains to the east troubled the empire's borders. Climate changes may have contributed to agricultural difficulties and social stress, though the evidence remains debated among scholars. By around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had collapsed, fragmenting once again into competing city-states and regional powers. Nevertheless, the memory of Akkadian achievement endured. Future rulers would look back to Sargon as a model of kingship and conquest. The Akkadian language continued to spread, eventually becoming the diplomatic language of the entire ancient Near East for more than 1,000 years. The principle that diverse peoples might be united under a single ruler, that empire could transcend city walls and tribal boundaries, had been established. The world had glimpsed a new possibility, and though the first empire fell, others would rise to follow the path Sargon had blazed through the ancient world, leaving footprints in the clay that time could not entirely erase. The fall of the Akkadian Empire left Mesopotamia fractured once more, its city-states scattered like beads from a broken necklace across the alluvial plains. For a time, chaos reigned as rival powers competed for dominance, and the great innovations of Sargon's administration seemed destined to fade into memory. Yet from this period of uncertainty emerged something unexpected, a revival of Sumerian culture and political power that would surpass even the legendary kingdoms of old. Around 2100 years before the Common Era, the third dynasty of rose to prominence, creating what historians now recognize as perhaps the most meticulously organized state the ancient world had yet seen. The city of itself stood as it had for millennia, its mud brick buildings rising from the flat landscape where the Euphrates curved gently through the southern plains. But under the new dynasty, particularly during the reign of Namu and his son Shulgi, the city transformed into something extraordinary. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the great ziggurat that began to dominate the skyline, a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to Nana, the moon god who watched over the city. Unlike earlier temple platforms, this structure represented architectural ambition on an unprecedented scale. Workers hauled millions of mud bricks to construct the ziggurat's 3 terraced levels, each slightly smaller than the one below, creating a mountain-like silhouette against the Mesopotamian sky. The outer facing consisted of baked bricks set in bitumen, providing protection against the elements while giving the structure an imposing permanence. Staircases ascended the monument's face, leading pilgrims and priests upward toward the heavens where the gods were believed to dwell. At the summit stood a small temple, a sacred space where the earthly and divine realms might meet. Even today, thousands of years later, the weathered remains of this ziggurat stand in the Iraqi desert, testifying to the ambitions of those ancient builders. But the true innovation of the Ur-III period lay not in monumental architecture alone, impressive as that was. Rather, it manifested in something less visible but far more revolutionary, the development of administrative systems that allowed rulers to govern vast territories with remarkable precision. The kings of Ur created what we might recognize as the world's first true bureaucracy, a complex web of officials, scribes, and record keepers who documented virtually every aspect of economic and political life. Clay tablets from this period survive in staggering numbers, tens of thousands of them, and they reveal a civilization obsessed with measurement, categorization, and control. Scribes sat in administrative offices throughout the empire, carefully recording the movement of goods, the assignment of workers, the collection of taxes, and the distribution of rations. Every sheep counted, every basket of grain accounted for, every day of labor documented in the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script pressed into wet clay. The state implemented standardized systems of weights and measures throughout its territories, ensuring that a unit of grain measured in one city meant precisely the same thing in another. This standardization facilitated trade and taxation, allowing the central administration to maintain accurate accounts of resources across the entire empire. Inspectors traveled from city to city, verifying that local officials adhered to these standards and reported their findings back to the capital. Labor organization reached levels of sophistication that would not be seen again for many centuries. The state controlled vast numbers of workers, organizing them into teams assigned to specific tasks for specific durations. Agricultural workers planted and harvested according to schedules determined by administrators. Craftsmen produced goods in quantities dictated by state needs. Even shepherds moved their flocks according to instructions from regional officials who tracked animal populations with meticulous care. These workers received rations from state storehouses, their allotments calculated based on their position, their output, and the number of dependents in their households. Clay tablets record these distributions in extraordinary detail, noting when a worker received barley, oil, or wool, and in what quantities. The system functioned like a vast machine, with human labor as its primary resource, all coordinated through written records that gave administrators unprecedented visibility into the workings of their economy. The kings of Ur styled themselves as shepherds of their people, protectors who ensured justice and prosperity throughout their realms. Ur-Nammu is credited with producing one of history's earliest law codes, predating even the famous laws of Hammurabi by several centuries. Though only fragments of this code survive, they reveal attention to matters of justice, compensation for injuries, and the regulation of economic transactions. The king presented himself as the intermediary between gods and humans, responsible for maintaining cosmic order in the earthly realm. Under Shulgi, who ruled for nearly half a century, the empire reached its greatest extent and administrative sophistication. This king claimed divine status during his lifetime, presenting himself as a god among mortals. He reformed the calendar, standardized the education of scribes, and established a network of way stations along major roads where royal messengers could rest and exchange mounts. ensuring rapid communication across the empire. Shulgi even claimed to have personally run the distance between the cities of Nippur and in a single day, a journey of perhaps 100 miles, though we might reasonably suspect some poetic exaggeration in this particular achievement. The scribal schools that flourished during this period trained young men in the complex art of cuneiform writing, requiring them to memorize thousands of signs and practice their formation for years before they could serve as professional scribes. These schools preserved and copied older Sumerian literature, creating something like a cultural renaissance as ancient texts were studied, reproduced, and transmitted to future generations. The scribes of saw themselves as guardians of tradition, linking their present to the legendary past of Sumerian civilization. Yet for all its impressive organization, the III state carried within itself the seeds of its own limitations. The very centralization that gave it strength also created vulnerability. The system required constant maintenance, an endless flow of clay tablets and loyal officials to keep the bureaucratic machinery functioning smoothly. When pressures mounted on the empire's frontiers, when agricultural production faltered, or when subject peoples grew restless, the carefully balanced system began to strain. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, the empire began to fracture. Nomadic peoples called the Amorites pressed against the western borders. The eastern territories declared independence. The administrative records become fewer, more scattered, suggesting a breakdown in the systems that had governed economic life. Finally, the city of itself fell to invaders from the east, and the third dynasty came to an end. A poignant Sumerian poem from this period, known as the Lament for describes the city's destruction in sorrowful terms, mourning the temples reduced to ruins and the population scattered. Yet even in collapse, the achievements of this period echoed forward through time. The administrative techniques, the architectural ambitions, and the cultural productions of the III period influenced all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations, providing models that later kingdoms would study and emulate as new powers rose to prominence in the land between the rivers. The banks of the Euphrates River had witnessed the rise and fall of many great powers, and as the third millennium before the Common Era drew to a close, the stage was set for a new player to emerge from the landscape of Mesopotamian politics. Far from the sea, situated along the middle stretches of the Euphrates, lay a city that would grow to become synonymous with ancient grandeur and lasting influence. This city was Babylon. For centuries, Babylon had existed as a modest settlement, overshadowed by older and more established centers of power. Archaeological evidence suggests that people had lived at this location since prehistoric times, drawn by the river's life-giving waters and the agricultural possibilities of the surrounding plain. Yet during the glory days of the III dynasty, and even during earlier periods, Babylon remained a relatively minor player in the complex political theater of Mesopotamia. The transformation began around 1894, before the Common Era, when a dynasty of Amorite chieftains established themselves as the rulers of Babylon. The Amorites were a Semitic-speaking people who had been gradually migrating into Mesopotamia from the western deserts for generations. Rather than destroying the existing urban culture, these newcomers embraced it, adopting Mesopotamian traditions while bringing their own administrative talents and diplomatic skills to the task of building a lasting state. The early kings of this new Babylonian dynasty were patient builders. They understood that power in Mesopotamia could not be seized through force alone, but required careful cultivation of alliances, strategic marriages, and the gradual accumulation of territory and resources. The city itself, occupied an enviable position along trade routes that connected the Persian Gulf with northern Mesopotamia and reached westward toward the Mediterranean lands. Merchants traveling these ancient highways would stop at Babylon to rest, trade goods, and pay customs duties that enriched the royal treasury. Within the city walls, construction projects began to transform Babylon's appearance. Temples were renovated and expanded, their mud brick facades gleaming with fresh plaster under the Mesopotamian sun. The rulers commissioned new buildings that proclaimed their devotion to the gods and their commitment to the city's prosperity. Among the most important of these sacred structures was the Temple of Marduk, the city's patron deity, whose significance would grow alongside Babylon's own rising fortunes. The streets of Babylon during this period would have hummed with activity. Scribes practiced their craft in schools attached to the temples, learning to write the ancient cuneiform characters that had been passed down from Sumerian times. Craftsmen worked in workshops, producing pottery, textiles, and metal goods for local use and distant trade. Farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their harvests to market, where the noise of bargaining and commerce filled the air with a constant, gentle murmur. Water management remained as crucial to Babylon as it had been to earlier Mesopotamian cities. Engineers maintained and extended the network of canals that drew water from the Euphrates, distributing it to fields of barley and date palm groves. The annual flood cycle continued to dictate the rhythm of agricultural life, and the successful administration of irrigation works was among the most important responsibilities of the Babylonian rulers. A king who maintained the canals and ensured abundant harvests earned the loyalty of his people and the favor of the gods. As Babylon's wealth increased, so too did its cultural ambitions. The city became a center for the preservation and copying of ancient texts. Scribes carefully reproduced literary works that had been composed centuries earlier, ensuring that the wisdom of previous generations would not be lost to time. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge was cultivated in the temple schools, where scholars recorded observations of the heavens and developed sophisticated systems of calculation that would influence later civilizations. The political landscape of Mesopotamia during this period resembled a mosaic of competing city-states and small kingdoms. To the north lay Assyria, already showing signs of the military prowess that would later make it feared throughout the ancient world. To the south, the old Sumerian cities continued their existence, though much diminished from their former glory. In this fragmented environment, Babylon's rulers pursued a careful strategy of expansion, absorbing neighboring territories through a combination of diplomatic pressure and occasional military campaigns. The Amorite kings of Babylon understood the importance of legitimacy. They portrayed themselves as the rightful heirs to the ancient traditions of Mesopotamian kingship, adopting titles and ceremonial practices that connected them to the glorious rulers of the past. In official inscriptions, they proclaimed their piety, their justice, and their dedication to maintaining the cosmic order that the gods had established. Building projects and canal maintenance were described in religious terms as acts of devotion that pleased the deities and ensured the prosperity of the land. Trade networks extending from Babylon reached remarkable distances. Goods from the Indus Valley, including precious stones and exotic materials, found their way to Babylonian markets. Copper from Oman, timber from the mountains of Lebanon, and luxury items from Anatolia all passed through the city's gates. In return, Babylonian merchants exported textiles, grain, and finished goods, gradually establishing the city as a crucial node in the web of ancient commerce. The organization of this growing city required increasingly sophisticated administrative systems. Scribes maintained detailed records of commercial transactions, legal proceedings, and temple revenues. The art of accounting, which had been developing in Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, reached new levels of complexity in Babylon. Clay tablets preserve evidence of loan contracts, property transfers, and business partnerships, offering glimpses into the economic life of ordinary Babylonians going about their daily affairs. Religious festivals continued to punctuate the calendar year, providing occasions for public celebration and reinforcing the bonds between the human community and the divine realm. Processions wound through Babylon's streets as statues of the gods were carried in solemn ceremony. Musicians played traditional melodies on lyres and drums, while priests performed ancient rituals whose origins reached back into the mists of time. As the 18th century, before the Common Era progressed, Babylon stood poised on the threshold of greatness. The patient work of several generations had transformed a modest river settlement into a prosperous and well-organized city-state. The stage was set for a ruler of exceptional ability to take these carefully assembled resources and fashion them into something truly remarkable, establishing Babylon not merely as one power among many, but as the dominant force in Mesopotamian politics and culture for centuries to come. As Babylon flourished under the Amorite dynasty, the city's growing power and influence required a framework to govern its increasingly complex society. Trade disputes arose in the bustling marketplaces, conflicts emerged over irrigation rights along the canals, and questions about property inheritance needed resolution. Into this world of expanding commerce and urban life stepped a ruler who would leave an indelible mark not just on Babylon, but on the very concept of written law itself. Hammurabi ascended to Babylon's throne around 1792 BCE, inheriting a kingdom that was prosperous but not yet dominant among Mesopotamia's competing powers. The young king proved to be both a capable military leader and a shrewd diplomat, gradually extending Babylonian control through a combination of conquest and alliance. But it would not be his military achievements alone that would echo through the millennia. Instead, his most enduring legacy would be carved in stone, a monument to justice that would speak across the centuries. In approximately 1750 BCE, after decades of rule, Hammurabi commissioned a remarkable artifact. Standing over 7 feet tall, a black diorite stele was carefully carved with columns of cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing that had evolved over 1,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. At the top of this stone pillar, artisans sculpted a scene showing Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and deity of justice. In this relief, the god extends to the king the rod and ring, ancient symbols of authority and righteousness, suggesting that the laws inscribed below carried divine sanction. The text that flowed down the stele in neat columns contained 282 laws, organized by subject matter in a way that reveals much about Babylonian society's concerns and values. These were not the first laws in Mesopotamia, for earlier rulers had also attempted to codify legal principles. But Hammurabi's code was more comprehensive, more systematically organized, and ultimately more famous than those that came before. The laws addressed a remarkable breadth of human activity. Commercial transactions received careful attention, reflecting Babylon's position as a trading center where merchants from distant lands exchanged goods, extended credit, and entered into partnerships. The code specified how contracts should be honored, what happened when merchants failed to deliver goods as promised, and how disputes over prices should be resolved. Interest rates on loans were regulated, protecting borrowers from excessive demands while ensuring lenders could profit from their risk. Agriculture, the foundation of Mesopotamian life, occupied many provisions. The code addressed rental arrangements for fields, specifying the share of harvest that tenant farmers owed to landowners. It dealt with irrigation responsibilities, a matter of life and death in a land dependent on carefully managed water. If a farmer neglected his section of canal and his carelessness caused flooding that damaged a neighbor's field, he would be required to compensate for the lost grain. These provisions reflected the reality that in Mesopotamia, cooperation in water management was essential for survival. Property rights received extensive treatment, covering everything from the sale of houses to the theft of livestock. The code specified punishments for theft that varied depending on what was stolen and from whom. It addressed disputes about ownership, establishing procedures for proving that property belonged to one party or another. Witnesses played a crucial role in these determinations, and the code dealt harshly with those who gave false testimony, recognizing that perjury undermined the entire system of justice. Family relationships and domestic life filled many of the law code's provisions. Marriage arrangements, inheritance rights, divorce proceedings, and adoption procedures all received attention. The code protected certain rights of women, allowing them to own property and conduct business, though within a patriarchal framework that granted husbands considerable authority. Matters of inheritance were carefully specified, determining how estates should be divided among sons and what provisions should be made for daughters. These laws provided predictability and structure to family life, reducing conflicts that might otherwise tear households apart. Professional standards for various trades appeared throughout the code, revealing the specialized occupations that urban life had created. Builders were held responsible for the quality of their construction, facing serious consequences if their structures collapsed. Physicians' fees were regulated, with payments varying based on the patient's social status. Boat builders, barbers, and other craftsmen all found their responsibilities and rights defined in the law's provisions. One of the code's most famous principles, often summarized as an eye for an eye, established proportional justice, where punishments should match the severity of offenses. This principle, while seeming harsh to modern sensibilities, actually represented a restraint on revenge, limiting retaliation to something equivalent to the original harm rather than allowing conflicts to escalate without bound. However, this proportionality applied differently depending on social status, reflecting Babylon's hierarchical society, where free citizens, dependent workers, and enslaved people occupied distinct legal positions. The laws were not meant to cover every possible situation, but rather to establish principles and precedents that judges could apply to specific cases. They provided a framework within which justice could be administered with some degree of consistency and predictability, moving beyond the arbitrary decisions of rulers who might judge each case solely on personal whim or political advantage. Hammurabi clearly intended his law code to be widely known. Copies were erected in cities throughout his kingdom, standing in public places where any citizen might see them. The stele proclaimed in its prologue that Hammurabi had been called by the gods to bring justice to the land, to protect the weak from the strong, and to ensure fair treatment for all his subjects. The code's epilogue called down blessings on future rulers who would respect these laws and curses on those who might alter or ignore them. The survival of Hammurabi's stele through the ages represents something of a journey itself. Centuries after its creation, the Elamites, during a raid into Mesopotamia, carried the monument away to their capital at Susa. There it remained for millennia until French archaeologists discovered it in 1901, bringing this ancient voice of justice back into the light. The significance of Hammurabi's achievement extends beyond the specific provisions of his laws. By committing these principles to writing and displaying them publicly, he created something revolutionary. The idea that law could exist as a known, external standard rather than simply the will of whoever held power at any given moment. This concept, that justice should be administered according to established principles rather than arbitrary authority, would influence legal thinking for millennia to come, rippling outward from ancient Babylon to shape civilizations across the world. As caravans continued to arrive at Babylon's gates and merchants conducted their business in the shadow of the Great Steel, they did so within a framework that sought, however imperfectly, to bring order and predictability to human affairs, one cuneiform character at a time. Beyond the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, far to the northwest, across rugged terrain and mountain passes, another great civilization was taking shape in the land we know today as Anatolia or ancient Turkey. Here, in a region of high plateaus and sheltered valleys, the Hittites were building a kingdom that would rival the powers of Babylon and Egypt, bringing their own innovations and perspectives to the ancient world. The Hittites called themselves the people of Hatti, though they had originally migrated into this region from elsewhere, settling among earlier inhabitants. Their heartland centered on the great loop of the Halys River in the central Anatolian plateau. This was a landscape quite different from the flat alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Mountains rose in sharp silhouettes against the sky, their peaks catching the first light of dawn and the last glow of evening. Forests of cedar and pine covered the slopes, and swift-running streams carved their way through rocky valleys. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, the Hittites established their capital at Hattusa, a city built upon dramatic rocky outcroppings that commanded views across the surrounding countryside. The builders of Hattusa understood the art of working with their environment. They constructed massive stone fortifications that followed the natural contours of the hills, creating walls that seemed to grow organically from the bedrock itself. These defensive walls, some sections rising more than 20 feet high, were punctuated by impressive gates adorned with carved lions and sphinxes that stood eternal watch over all who entered. Within these walls, the Hittite kings built their palaces and temples, creating a royal city that reflected their growing power and confidence. The architecture combined practical considerations with artistic vision. Stone foundations supported structures of timber and mud brick, while elaborate drainage systems managed the rainwater that fell more abundantly here than in the southern lands of Mesopotamia. The Hittites brought something revolutionary to the ancient world, a technological advancement that would eventually transform human civilization. They mastered the art of working iron. While earlier peoples had occasionally worked with meteoric iron, the Hittites developed techniques for smelting iron ore and forging it into useful tools and weapons. This was no simple achievement. Iron requires much higher temperatures to work than the copper and bronze that had served humanity for centuries. The Hittite smiths learned to build furnaces that could reach these temperatures, and they discovered how to hammer and temper the metal to create implements of remarkable strength and durability. For a time, the Hittites guarded this knowledge carefully, understanding the advantage it gave them. Their iron tools could till soil more effectively than bronze implements, and their iron-tipped weapons provided a significant edge in conflicts with neighboring peoples. The secret of ironworking represented not just technological knowledge, but economic and military power. As the Hittite kingdom grew stronger, its rulers looked beyond their Anatolian heartland. To the south and east lay the wealthy cities of Syria, crossroads of trade routes that connected Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean coast. The Hittites expanded their influence into this region, sometimes through military campaigns, sometimes through diplomacy and marriage alliances. They built garrison cities and established administrative centers to govern their growing empire. The Hittite approach to empire differed in certain ways from that of the Mesopotamian powers. While they could be formidable in battle, they also showed a remarkable sophistication in diplomatic relations. Hittite kings corresponded with their fellow monarchs in Egypt and Babylon, addressing them as brothers and negotiating treaties that were recorded on clay tablets and stone monuments. Perhaps the most famous of these diplomatic achievements was the treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, concluded after years of conflict over control of Syria. This agreement, dating to around 1250 BCE, represents one of the earliest surviving international peace treaties. Both sides agreed to respect each other's territories, to provide mutual assistance against common enemies, and even to extradite refugees who fled from one kingdom to the other. The treaty was recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, emphasizing the equal status of both great powers. The Hittites had adopted the cuneiform writing system from Mesopotamia, using it to record their own Indo-European language. But they also developed another script, one we call Anatolian hieroglyphics, used primarily for royal inscriptions and monuments. This dual writing system reflected their position between different cultural spheres, absorbing influences from various directions while maintaining their distinct identity. In their religious practices, the Hittites displayed a characteristic openness. They worshipped their own pantheon of deities, including the storm god who ruled over weather and fertility, and the sun goddess of Arana, one of their most important divine figures. But they also welcomed foreign gods into their religious life, incorporating deities from the peoples they encountered and conquered. This theological inclusiveness may seem surprising to us, but it reflected a worldview in which different gods could coexist, each with their own domains and powers. The great festivals of the Hittite calendar brought together religious devotion and royal authority. During these celebrations, the king himself played a central role, acting as the chief priest who mediated between the human and divine realms. Processions wound through the streets of Hattusa, carrying the sacred symbols of the gods, while priests and priestesses performed ancient rituals to ensure the continued blessing of the divine powers. Life in the Hittite realm varied considerably depending on one's station and location. In the capital, scribes trained in the complex art of writing, learning to press their styluses into clay tablets to record royal decrees, religious texts, treaties, and administrative documents. Merchants traveled the roads that connected Hattusa to distant markets, carrying Anatolian metals, timber, and grain to exchange for luxuries from other lands. Farmers worked the fields that spread across the valleys, growing wheat and barley, tending sheep and cattle that grazed on the upland pastures. The legal system of the Hittites, like that of other ancient civilizations, was recorded in written law codes. These laws reveal a society concerned with justice and proper compensation for wrongs. They detail appropriate punishments for various offenses, regulations for marriage and inheritance, and proper procedures for resolving disputes. In some ways, Hittite law appears less harsh than the codes of Mesopotamia, with fewer offenses resulting in capital punishment and more emphasis on restitution and compensation. As evening settles over the ancient world and we imagine the last light fading from the stone walls of Hattusa, we might picture the watchfires being lit along those mighty fortifications, their warm glow a small defiance against the gathering darkness. The Hittites had built something enduring here, a civilization that bridged different worlds, that took knowledge from various sources and transformed it into something uniquely their own. Their story reminds us that the ancient Middle East was never a single monolithic culture, but rather a rich tapestry of different peoples, each contributing their own threads to the larger pattern of human civilization. As we drift towards sleep, we can appreciate how these ancient accomplishments, from the forging of iron to the crafting of diplomatic agreements, laid foundations that would support the development of societies yet to come. As the mighty Hittite civilization held sway over the Anatolian highlands, far to the south in the heart of Mesopotamia, another story was quietly unfolding. The great dynasty of Hammurabi, which had elevated Babylon to unprecedented heights, was drawing to a close. When the Hittite king Mursili led his forces down the Euphrates and briefly captured Babylon around 1595 BCE, he created a power vacuum that would soon be filled by a people whose origins remain shrouded in the mists of time. The Kassites appeared on the stage of Mesopotamian history like travelers emerging from distant mountains. Their homeland likely lay in the Zagros ranges to the east, in the borderlands between the river valleys and the Iranian plateau. Unlike the dramatic military conquests that marked other dynasties, the Kassite assumption of power in Babylon was a gradual process, more like water seeping into sand than a sudden flood. By around 1570 BCE, they had established themselves as rulers of Babylonia, beginning what would become the longest ruling dynasty in Mesopotamian history. For more than 4 centuries, Kassite kings would sit upon the throne of Babylon, presiding over an era that modern scholars sometimes overlook, yet which was marked by remarkable stability and cultural continuity. These were not years of dramatic expansion or revolutionary change, but rather a long, peaceful afternoon in which the achievements of earlier ages were preserved, refined, and transmitted to the future. The Kassite rulers adopted Babylonian culture with an embrace so complete that within generations, distinguishing Kassite elements from traditional Babylonian ones becomes a challenge for archaeologists. They honored the ancient gods of Sumer and Akkad, maintained the cuneiform writing system, and supported the temple establishments that had been central to Mesopotamian life for millennia. The Kassite kings took Babylonian throne names and conducted their administration in the Akkadian language, though they retained their own deities, adding them to the already crowded pantheon of Mesopotamian gods. During this period, Babylon itself underwent continuous embellishment. The Kassites were devoted builders, restoring old temples and constructing new ones. They showed particular reverence for Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, whose temple complex they enhanced with careful attention. The city walls were maintained, the irrigation canals were kept flowing, and the agricultural lands that sustained the urban population continued their rhythmic cycles of planting and harvest. One of the most significant developments of the Kassite period was the refinement of land tenure systems. The Kassites introduced boundary stones called kudaru, carved monuments that recorded grants of land from the king to his officials or to temples. These stones, decorated with symbols of the gods and bearing lengthy inscriptions, served both practical and sacred purposes. They marked property boundaries while invoking divine protection against anyone who might move them or challenge the grants they recorded. Many of these kudaru have survived to the present day, providing historians with invaluable information about Kassite administration and society. The Kassite period coincided with what historians call the Late Bronze Age, an era of remarkable international connectivity across the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. This was a time when great powers maintained diplomatic relations through an elaborate system of correspondence, gift exchange, and dynastic marriages. The Kassite kings of Babylon were full participants in this cosmopolitan world. Among the most fascinating archaeological discoveries relating to this period are the Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence found at the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten's capital. Written in Akkadian, which served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, these clay tablets reveal a complex network of relationships between the major powers. The Kassite kings of Babylon exchanged letters with the pharaohs of Egypt, addressing each other as brothers and negotiating marriages, trading precious materials, and occasionally complaining about insufficient gifts or delayed caravans. Gold flowed from Egypt to Babylon, while lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan passed through Babylonian merchants on its way to Mediterranean shores. Horses, timber, and crafted luxury goods moved along trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and beyond. The Kassite rulers facilitated this commerce, and Babylon grew wealthy from the traffic that passed through its gates. Despite this prosperity and international prestige, the Kassite kings maintained a notably modest profile in the military sphere. Unlike the aggressive expansion of earlier Akkadian rulers or the later Assyrian campaigns, Kassite foreign policy emphasized diplomacy and trade over conquest. Their military activities were generally defensive or focused on maintaining control over their core territories. This restraint, or perhaps wisdom, contributed to the remarkable length of their dynasty's survival. Cultural and intellectual life flourished under Kassite patronage. Scribal schools continued their ancient work of training new generations in the intricate art of cuneiform writing. Literary texts were copied and recopied, ensuring the preservation of works like the Gilgamesh epic, creation myths, and mathematical treatises. The Babylonian astronomical traditions, which would later influence Greek science, developed their systematic observations of celestial phenomena during these centuries. The Kassites also made contributions to architectural practice, including refinements in brickmaking and the use of molded bricks to create decorative facades on important buildings. They continued the Mesopotamian tradition of building ziggurats, though their structures were generally renovations of earlier temple towers rather than entirely new constructions. As the centuries passed, the Kassite dynasty gradually weakened, facing pressure from new peoples moving into Mesopotamia and challenges from the growing power of Assyria to the north. Around 1155 BCE, Elamite invaders from the east finally brought Kassite rule to an end, carrying away the statue of Marduk from Babylon itself, an act that symbolized the dynasty's fall. Yet the Kassite contribution to Mesopotamian civilization was profound precisely because it was conservative rather than revolutionary. They served as guardians of traditions, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of Sumerian and Babylonian culture survived intact through turbulent centuries. Without their long stewardship, much of what would later be considered classical Babylonian culture might have been lost. The diplomatic practices, literary traditions, and administrative techniques preserved during their rule would provide foundations for the later revivals of Babylonian power. As night settles over the ancient tell where Babylon once stood, we can imagine those long Kassite centuries as a time when scribes bent over their tablets by lamplight, when merchants tallied accounts in familiar scripts, when farmers worked fields their ancestors had cultivated, all beneath the protection of a dynasty that valued continuity over conquest, preservation over innovation, and the patient work of maintaining civilization's hard-won achievements. As the Kassite dynasty maintained its long stewardship over Babylon, far to the north another power was quietly developing its own distinct character and destiny. The region of Assyria, named for its primary city of Ashur, occupied the northern stretches of Mesopotamia, where the landscape and climate differed markedly from the southern alluvial plains. Here, in the upper reaches of the Tigris River Valley, a people were building a civilization that would eventually reshape the ancient world. The Assyrian Heartland enjoyed advantages that set it apart from the sun-baked cities of the south. Rain fell more reliably in these northern latitudes, allowing agriculture to flourish without the intensive irrigation systems that dominated life in Sumer and Babylon. Fields of barley and wheat grew with the seasonal rains, and the surrounding hills provided timber, stone, and metal ores that were scarce in the southern plains. This abundance of natural resources gave Assyria a foundation for growth that did not depend solely on the unpredictable moods of great rivers. The city of Ashur itself perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Tigris, a natural fortress that commanded the river crossing and the trade routes that wound through the valley. From its earliest days, Ashur served as both a commercial center and a religious sanctuary. The god Ashur, who shared his name with the city, presided over the spiritual life of the people, and his temple complex grew steadily as merchants and farmers prospered in his shadow. Unlike the towering ziggurats of the south, the temple of Ashur was rebuilt and expanded many times over the centuries, each generation adding to the sacred architecture in an unbroken tradition of devotion. To the north of Ashur lay Nineveh, positioned where the Kossa River joined the Tigris. This ancient settlement, inhabited since prehistoric times, would eventually rise to extraordinary prominence, but in these earlier periods, it served as a regional center connected by ties of culture and commerce to Ashur. The relationship between these cities and others in the Assyrian Heartland created a network of mutual support that strengthened the entire region. What truly distinguished early Assyria, however, was the entrepreneurial spirit of its merchants. While the city-states of the south engaged in trade, Assyrian merchants developed something remarkably sophisticated for the early 2nd millennium BCE. They established merchant colonies far beyond their homeland, particularly in Anatolia, the region we know today as Central Turkey. These trading posts, called Karams, became thriving outposts of Assyrian commercial activity in foreign lands. The most famous of these colonies flourished at Kanesh, near modern Kultep, where Assyrian merchants created an entire district outside the local Anatolian city. These traders weren't conquerors or raiders, but peaceful commercial agents who lived among foreign peoples while maintaining their Assyrian identity and practices. They built homes in the Assyrian style, worshipped their gods in private shrines, and most importantly, they kept meticulous records. These merchants dealt primarily in textiles and tin, goods that they transporting by donkey caravan across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The textiles, woven in Assyria and other Mesopotamian centers, were highly prized in Anatolia for their quality and craftsmanship. Tin, essential for bronze production, flowed along trade routes from sources far to the east, and the Assyrian merchants served as crucial middlemen in this precious metal trade. In exchange, they received silver and gold from Anatolian mines, enriching both themselves and their home cities. The scale of this commerce was impressive. Archaeological excavations at Kanesh have revealed thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, business records written in old Assyrian cuneiform that document loans, partnerships, shipments, and transactions spanning generations of merchant families. These archives provide an intimate glimpse into the daily concerns of ancient businessmen. Anxious letters from partners about delayed caravans, careful calculations of profit margins, disputes over the quality of goods, and family correspondence mixing business with personal news. Reading these tablets, we can sense the rhythms of these merchants' lives. A trader might spend years abroad, managing operations at the Karam, while his brothers or sons handled affairs back in Ashur. Wives sometimes participated in the family business, weaving textiles or managing household finances. The tablets reveal a society where commercial law was well developed, where contracts were honored, and where reputation mattered enormously in an interconnected world of long-distance trade. Back in the Assyrian Heartland, the wealth generated by this trade enriched temples and palaces. The city of Ashur expanded, its walls encompassing growing neighborhoods of merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. The rulers of Ashur in this period were not yet the mighty emperors who would later command vast armies, but rather merchant princes whose authority derived from their city's commercial success and religious prestige. The agricultural abundance of the region supported this commercial activity. The northern climate, with its winter rains and cooler summers, allowed different crops to thrive compared to the south. Orchards of fruit trees dotted the hillsides, and vineyards produced wine that became a valued trade commodity. The nearby mountains provided summer pasture for sheep and goats, whose wool fed the textile industry that was so central to Assyrian prosperity. Stone from local quarries allowed Assyrian builders to construct in ways impossible for their southern neighbors, who relied on mud brick in their stoneless plains. This access to building stone would later enable the creation of the monumental palaces and fortifications for which Assyria would become famous, though in these earlier centuries, the architecture remained modest and functional. The cultural identity that emerged in this northern heartland blended elements borrowed from the south with distinctly local traditions. The Assyrians adopted cuneiform writing and many religious concepts from Sumerian and Babylonian civilization, yet they developed their own dialect of the Akkadian language and their own artistic styles. Their cylinder seals, used to mark documents and property, featured motifs that became characteristically Assyrian, different from the imagery preferred in Babylon or the old Sumerian cities. As centuries passed, the fortunes of Assyria rose and fell with the shifting currents of regional politics and economics. The merchant colonies in Anatolia eventually faded as political conditions changed and new powers emerged in that distant land. Yet the experience of organizing far-flung trading networks, of maintaining communication across vast distances, and of integrating diverse economic activities into a coherent system proved invaluable. These skills, developed during the old Assyrian period of merchant enterprise, would later be adapted to the administration of an empire. In the quiet fields along the upper Tigris, in the busy streets of Ashur, where merchants tallied their accounts, and in the distant Karams, where Assyrian traders lived among foreign peoples, a unique civilization was taking shape. The Assyrian Heartland, blessed with reliable rainfall and abundant resources, supported a population that combined agricultural productivity with commercial sophistication. This combination of strengths would serve them well in the centuries to come, as Assyria prepared to step onto the wider stage of ancient Near Eastern history. The northern cities of Assyria had long watched the movements of empires rise and fall across Mesopotamia. From their position along the upper reaches of the Tigris River, these communities had developed their own character, their own traditions, their own understanding of how to survive in a world of competing powers. Now, as the centuries progressed into what historians would later call the Neo-Assyrian period, the time had come for these northern kingdoms to step beyond their traditional boundaries and reshape the political landscape of the entire ancient Middle East. The transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. In the 10th century before the Common Era, Assyrian rulers started extending their influence beyond the rain-fed plains surrounding their ancestral cities. Where earlier generations had been content with securing trade routes and defending their borders, these new monarchs harbored grander ambitions. They looked southward to the wealthy cities of Babylonia, westward to the prosperous trading centers along the Mediterranean coast, and eastward to the mountain kingdoms rich in timber and precious metals. One of the pivotal figures in this expansion was Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled during the 9th century. From his palace at Kalhu, known to later peoples as Nimrud, he organized military campaigns that would establish patterns of conquest and administration for generations to come. The armies that marched forth from Assyrian cities were not merely raiding parties seeking plunder and glory. They represented a systematic approach to building something unprecedented in scale, a truly territorial empire that would directly govern distant lands rather than simply extracting tribute from them. The methods employed by these expanding Assyrian forces were practical and effective. When a city surrendered peacefully, it might be incorporated into the growing empire with its local structures largely intact, required only to pay regular tribute and acknowledge Assyrian supremacy. The administrative systems developed to manage these conquered territories showed remarkable sophistication. Provincial governors were appointed to oversee regions, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and ensuring that the flow of resources continued steadily back to the Assyrian Heartland. Communication across such vast distances presented enormous challenges. To address this, Assyrian engineers and planners created an extensive network of roads connecting the far-flung provinces to the imperial centers. These weren't mere dirt paths worn by centuries of foot traffic, but carefully maintained routes that allowed for the rapid movement of armies, messengers, and trade caravans. Along these roads, at regular intervals, relay stations were established where royal messengers could exchange tired horses for fresh ones, ensuring that information could travel from one end of the empire to the other with remarkable speed. The relay system represented an innovation in governmental administration that would be emulated by later empires for centuries. A message from a distant governor could reach the royal court in a matter of days rather than weeks. Reports of unrest, requests for resources, or news of foreign threats could be communicated and addressed with unprecedented efficiency. This network of roads and stations bound the empire together, creating arteries through which flowed not just information, but also the very lifeblood of commerce and military power. Under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in the 8th century, the administrative sophistication of the empire reached new heights. This monarch reorganized the provincial system, reducing the size of individual provinces to make them more manageable and less likely to become independent power centers. He appointed royal officials directly answerable to the throne, creating a bureaucracy that could implement imperial policies across diverse regions and cultures. The integration of conquered peoples presented its own unique challenges. The Assyrian solution, employed particularly by Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors, involved the strategic relocation of populations. Communities from one part of the empire might be moved to entirely different regions, while other groups took their place. This policy, while certainly disruptive to those affected, served multiple purposes from the imperial perspective. It helped prevent rebellions by breaking up concentrated ethnic groups. It brought skilled workers to regions where their expertise was needed, and it created a more cosmopolitan empire where diverse peoples lived side by side. The provinces themselves varied enormously in character and resources. In the west, Assyrian governors oversaw territories that bordered the Mediterranean, controlling access to maritime trade and the valuable cedar forests of Lebanon. To the east, mountain provinces provided minerals, stone, and timber from regions quite different from the Mesopotamian plains. In the south, ancient Babylonian cities with their long histories and proud traditions required particularly delicate handling, as these populations possessed cultural prestige that even their Assyrian overlords recognized and to varying degrees respected. The flow of resources into the Assyrian Heartland transformed the ancient cities. Tribute arrived in the form of precious metals, exotic woods, horses, textiles, and agricultural products from climates different from northern Mesopotamia. Craftsmen brought specialized skills from their homelands, contributing to the cosmopolitan character of Assyrian urban life. The wealth generated by this system funded not only military campaigns, but also ambitious building projects that would leave lasting monuments to Assyrian power. Military organization underpinned all these achievements. The Assyrian army evolved into a sophisticated force with specialized units, including chariotry, cavalry, infantry, and siege engineers. The ability to conduct prolonged sieges against fortified cities gave Assyrian forces a decisive advantage. Engineers developed battering rams, siege towers, and techniques for undermining city walls. This military capability allowed the empire to subdue even the most determined resistance. Yet the empire was more than just military might and administrative efficiency. It also served as a vast arena for cultural exchange. Scribes in provincial centers copied texts in multiple languages, preserving knowledge from various traditions. Aramaic, a Semitic language easier to write than cuneiform, began spreading as a lingua franca across the empire, eventually becoming the common tongue for diplomacy and commerce throughout the ancient Middle East. This linguistic development would have profound consequences for the region's future. As the 8th and 7th centuries progressed, the Assyrian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. From the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia, from the highlands of Iran to the delta of Egypt, Assyrian authority held sway. The administrative systems, the roads, the relay stations, and the integrated economy represented achievements in governance that marked a new chapter in human political organization. The very concept of empire, as distinct from the looser hegemonies of earlier ages, found its full expression in these carefully administered provinces, bound together by loyalty or necessity to the Assyrian throne. The great empire that stretched across the ancient world required centers worthy of its power and ambition. As the Assyrian kings extended their reach across vast territories, they turned their attention homeward, transforming their capitals into cities that would inspire awe in all who approached them. These were not merely places of administration and military command, but monuments to human achievement, centers of learning where the knowledge of millennia was carefully preserved for future generations. The city of Nineveh, ancient even by Assyrian standards, rose to unprecedented grandeur during the 7th century BCE. Under King Sennacherib, this settlement on the eastern bank of the Tigris underwent a remarkable transformation. The king dreamed of a capital unlike any the world had seen, and he possessed the resources and determination to make that vision real. Workers came from across the empire, bringing with them skills and techniques from countless traditions, all focused on a single ambitious project. Sennacherib's engineers first turned their attention to the city walls. These were not simply defensive barriers, but monumental statements rising some 40 feet into the sky, stretching for nearly 8 miles around the city's perimeter. 15 great gates pierced these walls, each bearing the name of an Assyrian deity and decorated with protective figures whose carved features caught the light of dawn and dusk. Through these gates flowed the commerce and culture of an empire, merchants and messengers, tribute bearers and travelers, all passing beneath the watchful stone guardians. Within these protective walls, the king created a palace that seemed to defy the limits of construction. The Southwest Palace, as later scholars would call it, sprawled across several acres of elevated ground. Its corridors and chambers numbered in the dozens, each designed for specific functions of governance, ceremony, and royal life. But what truly distinguished this palace were the stone slabs that lined its walls, carved with scenes of such detail and artistry that they seemed almost alive. These carved reliefs depicted the achievements of the king in endless procession. There were scenes of construction, showing workers hauling massive stone blocks and building siege ramps. There were images of gardens and waterways, of hunting expeditions where the king demonstrated his prowess, and of military campaigns where fortified cities yielded to Assyrian determination. The stone carvers worked with remarkable skill, capturing texture and movement, the muscles of horses in mid-stride, the patterns of flowing water, the individual leaves of date palms swaying in some eternal breeze. Sennacherib took particular pride in his mastery of water, that precious resource in a land where rainfall could not always be trusted. He commissioned an elaborate system of canals that brought water from distant mountain sources, flowing across valleys on aqueducts built of millions of precisely fitted stones. These waterways served practical purposes, bringing fresh water to the growing population and irrigating the fields that fed them. But they also enabled something more remarkable. Around his palace, the king created gardens of legendary beauty. These were not simple plots of vegetables or grain, but elaborate pleasure gardens filled with plants gathered from across the known world. Trees from distant mountains grew beside species from southern marshlands. Flowers from foreign lands bloomed in carefully tended beds. Water flowed through these gardens in streams and fountains, the sound of it creating an atmosphere of peace and abundance. The gardens rose in terraces, built up on elaborate supporting arches, creating the impression of a green mountain in the midst of the urban landscape. When Sennacherib's grandson Ashurbanipal came to rule, he continued the tradition of monumental building, constructing his own palace in Nineveh. But this king's greatest passion was not for stone and water, but for the written word. Throughout the empire, clay tablets had accumulated for thousands of years, containing the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization. Temple libraries, scribal schools, and private collections housed texts on every imaginable subject. Ashurbanipal determined to gather this knowledge, to create a collection that would preserve the learning of the ages. The king sent his agents throughout the empire with specific instructions. They were to seek out tablets containing ancient literature, religious texts, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, magical incantations, historical records, and scholarly commentaries. When original tablets could not be obtained, scribes were set to work making careful copies, ensuring that the text was reproduced exactly, every wedge-shaped mark pressed into the clay precisely as in the original. The library that took shape in the palace at Nineveh grew to contain tens of thousands of tablets. They were organized by subject and stored in systematic arrangements that allowed the learned to find specific texts among the vast collection. Clay tags identified the contents of different groups of tablets, creating an early form of cataloging system. Some tablets bore notes indicating which room of the palace they belonged to, ensuring that borrowed texts could be returned to their proper places. The subjects covered in this great library reflected the full range of Mesopotamian intellectual achievement. There were copies of the great literary works, including multiple versions of stories that had been told and retold for generations. Scientific texts recorded observations of the stars and planets, tracking their movements with mathematical precision. Medical texts described symptoms and treatments, combining practical observation with traditional healing practices. Texts on divination explained how to interpret omens and predict future events from the flight of birds, the patterns in smoke, or the shapes found in animal organs. The scribes who worked in the library and maintained this vast collection were among the most educated individuals in the empire. Reading and writing cuneiform script required years of training, beginning in childhood and continuing through long apprenticeship. A scribe needed to master hundreds of signs, each of which could represent different sounds or concepts depending on context. They needed to know not only contemporary Akkadian, but also ancient Sumerian, which remained the language of scholarship and religion long after it ceased to be spoken in daily life. These scholars copied and studied the old texts, adding their own commentaries and explanations. They compiled word lists and grammatical guides to help preserve understanding of ancient languages. They created bilingual dictionaries, showing equivalent words in Sumerian and Akkadian. They compared different versions of the same text, noting variations and attempting to establish accurate versions. In doing so, they were practicing methods that would be recognized as scholarly techniques thousands of years later. The palace libraries also contained administrative records that documented the vast scope of Assyrian achievement. Letters from provincial governors reported on local conditions and sought guidance on various matters. Treaties with foreign powers laid out terms of peace and alliance. Lists catalogued tribute received from subject territories, recording quantities of gold and silver, precious stones, exotic woods, fine textiles, and rare animals. Census records tracked population movements and labor assignments. Beyond Nineveh, other Assyrian cities maintained their own collections of tablets and their own traditions of learning. The ancient city of Ashur, the religious heart of the empire, housed temple libraries where priests preserved ritual texts and religious literature. Other capitals built by earlier kings contained their own archives and collections, each contributing to the preservation of knowledge across the empire. The very existence of these libraries reflected a profound understanding. The Assyrian kings recognized that power rested not only in armies and tribute, but in knowledge itself. By preserving the wisdom of past generations, by maintaining records of their own achievements, and by continuing to pursue learning, they were building something intended to outlast any individual reign or dynasty. They were creating monuments not just of stone, but of thought and word, preserving the intellectual heritage of civilization. As evening falls on our story tonight, we might picture those ancient libraries in the quiet hours when the business of the day had ceased. Scribes working by lamplight, carefully pressing their styluses into soft clay, preserving one more text for posterity. The tablets drying on shelves, waiting to be filed in their proper places among thousands of others. And somewhere in those vast collections, the wisdom of millennia resting silent in the darkness, waiting for readers yet to come. After the grandeur of Ashurbanipal's library and the magnificent cities of Assyria, let us turn our attention to the greatest treasure preserved within those very tablet collections. Among the thousands of clay tablets carefully catalogued and stored in Nineveh's royal archives, scribes had copied and recopied an ancient story that had already been old when Ashurbanipal's scholars first encountered it. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that had traveled across centuries, transforming and growing richer with each retelling, until it became the most celebrated literary work of the ancient Middle East. The story's origins reach back into the mists of Sumerian history, perhaps as early as 2100 BCE, when poets first composed brief verses about Gilgamesh, a king who may have actually ruled the city of Uruk. These early Sumerian poems existed as separate tales, individual episodes celebrating the mighty king's adventures. One described his friendship with a wild man. Another told of his journey to the cedar forest. Yet another recounted his quest to achieve immortality after losing someone dear to him. These poems circulated independently, recited in temple courtyards and palace halls, their words bringing ancient heroes to life for audiences who gathered in the evening hours. As centuries passed and the Akkadian language gradually became the common tongue of Mesopotamia, these separate Sumerian tales were woven together into a unified epic narrative. Scribes writing in Akkadian around 1800 BCE began combining the individual stories, adding new material, developing deeper themes, and transforming disconnected episodes into a coherent journey of transformation and wisdom. The epic continued to evolve, with different versions circulating throughout the ancient Middle East, reaching as far as the Hittite lands of Anatolia, where it was translated yet again. The version discovered in Ashurbanipal's library represents what scholars call the standard Babylonian version, a carefully edited text written on 12 tablets. This version, refined and polished over countless retellings, presents Gilgamesh not merely as a mighty warrior, but as a complex character who undergoes profound change through his experiences. The story opens in Uruk, that ancient city we encountered in earlier chapters, now described in poetic language as a place of magnificent walls and sacred temples. Gilgamesh himself is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a semi-divine king whose tremendous strength and boundless energy make him a demanding ruler. The people of Uruk, exhausted by his constant calls for grand projects and competitions, cry out to the gods for relief. In response, the goddess Aruru creates Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals in the grasslands beyond the city, knowing nothing of civilization. He is innocent, powerful, and completely untamed, running with gazelles and drinking at waterholes alongside wild creatures. When Gilgamesh learns of this wild man, he sends forth a temple woman to civilize Enkidu. Through her gentle guidance, Enkidu tastes bread, drinks beer, and learns the customs of human society. He covers his nakedness with clothing and begins to understand the ways of civilized life. Yet this transformation comes with loss, for the wild animals now flee from him, sensing that he has become something other than they are. This theme of civilization, bringing both gain and loss, echoes throughout the epic, a meditation on what humans surrender when they leave behind more natural ways of living. When Enkidu finally enters Uruk and meets Gilgamesh, the two engage in a tremendous contest of strength. Neither can overcome the other, and this mutual respect transforms instantly into deep friendship. The two become inseparable companions, and their friendship changes Gilgamesh, channeling his tremendous energy toward worthy goals rather than simply dominating his city. Together, they decide to journey to the distant cedar forest to confront Humbaba, the fearsome guardian appointed by the gods to protect the sacred trees. Their journey to the cedar forest takes them through wild lands, and along the way, Gilgamesh experiences troubling dreams. Each time, Enkidu offers interpretations that encourage his friend to continue. When they finally reach the forest, the description of the towering cedars and the terrible guardian creates an atmosphere of awe and danger. The battle with Humbaba tests both heroes, but they prevail through their combined strength and courage. Yet the Guardians' dying words carry a curse, suggesting that their victory may bring unforeseen consequences. Upon returning to Uruk, the goddess Ishtar, impressed by Gilgamesh's glory, proposes marriage to him. But Gilgamesh refuses, recounting the sad fates of her previous lovers. Enraged by this rejection, Ishtar persuades her father to send the bull of heaven against Uruk. The divine bull causes terrible destruction, but once again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight together and slay the beast. Their triumph, however, angers the gods, who convene to discuss the mortals' repeated defiance of divine will. The gods decree that one of the two friends must die as punishment. Enkidu falls ill, and as he weakens, he dreams of the underworld, describing it as a dark place of dust where the dead exist as shadows, clothed in feathers like birds, dwelling in eternal gloom. This vision of the afterlife reflects Mesopotamian beliefs about death as a somber, inevitable fate awaiting all mortals. Enkidu's death devastates Gilgamesh, who refuses at first to accept that his companion is truly gone, sitting vigil beside the body until decay becomes undeniable. Confronted with mortality through his friend's death, Gilgamesh becomes obsessed with escaping the same fate. He abandons his royal garments and wanders into the wilderness, searching for Utnapishtim, the one human granted immortality by the gods after surviving a great flood. Gilgamesh's journey takes him through lands of darkness, past the scorpion guardians of the rising sun, and across the waters of death with the help of a ferryman. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim's distant shore, the ancient survivor tells him the story of the Great Flood, describing how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a deluge, but one deity warned him to build a boat and save his family and the animals. After the flood waters subsided and his boat came to rest on a mountain, Utnapishtim sent forth birds to find dry land, eventually making offerings that pleased the gods. For preserving life through this catastrophe, Utnapishtim and his wife alone among mortals received the gift of eternal life. Yet Utnapishtim explains that his immortality was a unique, unrepeatable circumstance. There will be no second flood, no second exception to mortality's rule. To demonstrate the futility of Gilgamesh's quest, Utnapishtim challenges him to remain awake for merely 7 days, but exhausted Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep, proving he cannot even conquer sleep, death's gentle cousin. Taking pity on the disappointed hero, Utnapishtim's wife persuades her husband to reveal one final secret, a plant growing in the depths of the ocean that can restore youth. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet and descends to pluck this precious plant, intending to bring it back to Uruk to benefit his people. But on the journey home, while Gilgamesh bathes in a cool pond, a serpent smells the plant's sweet fragrance, steals it, and slithers away, shedding its old skin for a fresh one. Thus the snake gained what Gilgamesh sought, the ability to renew itself, while the hero lost his final chance at conquering death. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, yet transformed. The epic concludes with Gilgamesh showing the ferryman the mighty walls of his city, the same walls mentioned in the opening. But now, the king understands that immortality lies not in escaping death, but in creating works that endure. The walls of Uruk, the temples and monuments, the civilization itself, these would outlast any individual life, carrying forward the achievements of mortal hands. This ancient story, preserved through millennia on clay tablets, speaks to timeless human concerns, the longing for friendship, the fear of death, the search for meaning in a finite existence. As we rest here, thinking of those ancient scribes who carefully pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay to preserve these words, we can appreciate how their labor succeeded in granting the epic its own form of immortality, allowing voices from humanity's distant past to whisper still across the ages. After the great Assyrian Empire crumbled and its mighty cities fell to dust, the ancient land of Babylonia stirred once more with renewed vigor. The year 612 BCE had witnessed the fall of Nineveh, and from the ashes of Assyrian dominance, a new dynasty emerged to restore Babylon to heights of splendor that would echo through the ages. This was the Neo-Babylonian period, often called the Chaldean Dynasty, a time when the ancient city between the rivers would shine with unprecedented brilliance. The Chaldeans were people who had settled in the marshy lands of southern Mesopotamia, and through careful alliance and military prowess, they had helped bring down the Assyrian colossus. Nabopolassar, the founder of this new dynasty, established Babylon once again as the center of the known world. But it would be his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would transform the city into a wonder that captured the imagination of all who beheld it. Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne in 605 BCE, and his reign of more than 4 decades would become legendary. He was not merely a conqueror, though his armies marched far and wide. He was a builder, a patron of learning, and a king who envisioned Babylon as the greatest city the world had ever seen. Under his guidance, artisans and laborers worked tirelessly to create monuments that would define an age. The city walls of Babylon grew to staggering dimensions during this Renaissance. Ancient writers would later speak of walls so wide that chariots could race along their tops, so high that they seemed to touch the heavens. These fortifications stretched for miles, encompassing gardens, palaces, and temples in their protective embrace. The Euphrates River flowed through the heart of the city, spanned by bridges that connected one half of the metropolis to the other. Among all the architectural achievements of this period, the Ishtar Gate stood supreme in its beauty. Named for the goddess of love and war, this massive entrance to the inner city was covered entirely in glazed bricks of brilliant blue, the color of lapis lazuli, that precious stone so treasured throughout Mesopotamian history. Upon this azure canvas, artisans had created images of bulls and dragons in raised relief, covered in glazes of yellow and white that seemed to glow in the Mesopotamian sun. The processional way that led through the Ishtar Gate was itself a marvel, its walls decorated with lions striding eternally forward, their forms created from thousands upon thousands of carefully crafted glazed bricks. During religious festivals, priests and worshippers would walk this sacred path, surrounded by these protective beasts, making their way to the great temple complex of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. The ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, called Etemenanki in the ancient tongue, meaning Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, rose in massive stages above the city. This was perhaps the very tower that inspired later tales of humanity's ambition reaching toward the sky. 7 levels of brick and bitumen climbed upward, each stage painted a different color, creating a rainbow of human achievement that could be seen from miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Yet of all the wonders attributed to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, none captured imagination quite like the Hanging Gardens. Ancient sources describe these as a marvel of engineering and beauty, though their exact location remains a subject of gentle mystery. According to tradition, the king built these terraced gardens for his wife, a Median princess who longed for the green mountains of her homeland amid the flat expanses of Babylonia. The gardens were said to rise in tiers, each level planted with trees, flowers, and vines, creating the appearance of a green mountain in the midst of the city. Water, that most precious resource in Mesopotamia, was somehow lifted from the Euphrates to irrigate the highest terraces, flowing down through the levels in a constant cascade of moisture and life. Shade-loving plants grew beneath larger trees, creating cool grottos where one might escape the intense heat of summer. The scent of flowers mingled with the sound of falling water, creating an oasis of tranquility within the bustling metropolis. But Neo-Babylonian achievement extended far beyond impressive architecture. This period witnessed a remarkable flowering of scientific and mathematical inquiry, particularly in the realm of astronomy. Babylonian scholars had been studying the night sky for millennia, but during this Renaissance, their observations became increasingly systematic and precise. These ancient astronomers recorded the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy, creating detailed tables that tracked the positions of planets across the dome of heaven. They could predict lunar eclipses and understood the cyclical nature of celestial events. Their observations were recorded on clay tablets in the elegant cuneiform script that had served Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. The Babylonian understanding of mathematics reached new sophistication during this era. They refined the sexagesimal system based on the number 60 that had been developed by earlier Mesopotamian cultures. This mathematical framework gave us concepts that endure to this day: the division of the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. Babylonian mathematicians could solve complex algebraic problems and worked with concepts that approached early forms of geometry. Priests in Babylon's temples served not only religious functions, but also acted as scholars and scribes, preserving the wisdom of previous ages while adding their own observations and insights. They copied ancient texts, ensuring that the Epic of Gilgamesh, the creation stories, and the accumulated knowledge of Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations would not be lost. Libraries within temple complexes housed thousands of clay tablets, creating repositories of human knowledge that spanned generations. The city's commercial life thrived during this period of peace and prosperity. Merchants from distant lands arrived along ancient trade routes, bringing goods from the mountains of Anatolia, the Mediterranean coast, the Persian highlands, and even more distant realms. The markets of Babylon offered spices, textiles, metals, and precious stones. Banking houses, some operated by the same families for generations, facilitated complex financial transactions using clay tablets as receipts and contracts. As Nebuchadnezzar's long reign drew toward its close, Babylon stood as the jewel of the ancient world, a city where the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization had been preserved and expanded. The blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate gleamed in the sun, the terraced gardens grew lush and green, and scholars studied the heavens from temple observatories, continuing work that had begun when the first Sumerian priests had looked upward and wondered at the dance of stars and planets across the night sky. This Neo-Babylonian Renaissance represented both a culmination and a transition. It gathered together the threads of thousands of years of Mesopotamian achievement while standing on the threshold of a new age that was already dawning to the east, where Persian power was beginning to rise among the mountains and plateaus of the Iranian highlands. As the great Assyrian cities fell to flames and the Neo-Babylonian kings began rebuilding their ancient capital along the Euphrates, another power had been rising steadily in the highlands to the east. Beyond the Zagros Mountains, in the region of western Iran, a people known as the Medes had been organizing themselves into a formidable kingdom that would reshape the political landscape of the ancient Middle East. The Medes were an Indo-European people who had migrated into the Iranian plateau centuries earlier, settling in the fertile valleys and highlands of what is now northwestern Iran. Unlike the urbanized civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Medes initially lived as pastoral communities, moving their herds across mountain pastures and gathering in seasonal settlements. Their homeland offered a landscape quite different from the river plains to the west, a terrain of mountains and high plateaus, with cold winters and scattered areas of agricultural potential. By the 8th century BCE, the Medes had begun to coalesce into larger political units. Assyrian records mention them frequently during this period, describing raids, tribute collection, and the complex relationship between the empire and these highland peoples. The Assyrians valued the Medes for their horses, which were among the finest in the ancient world, bred in the mountain pastures where the climate and terrain produced strong, swift animals ideal for warfare and royal stables. The process by which the Medes transformed from scattered tribes into a unified kingdom remains somewhat mysterious, as the Medes themselves left few written records. Much of what we know comes from later sources, particularly Greek historians like Herodotus, whose accounts, while invaluable, must be approached with careful consideration. According to these traditions, a leader named Deioces united the Median tribes around the middle of the 7th century BCE, establishing a capital at Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, in Iran. Ecbatana occupied a strategic position at the junction of important trade routes, situated in a fertile valley surrounded by mountains. The city would become legendary in later accounts for its magnificent fortifications, described as consisting of 7 concentric walls, each painted a different color, with the innermost walls plated with silver and gold. While these descriptions may contain elements of embellishment, they reflect the city's importance as a symbol of Median power and prosperity. The Median kingdom developed a political structure based on their earlier tribal organization. Rather than the centralized bureaucracy of Mesopotamian empires, the Medes maintained a confederation system where various tribal groups retained significant autonomy while acknowledging the authority of a paramount king. This flexibility would prove to be both a strength and a weakness. It allowed for the incorporation of diverse groups, but also created potential for internal division. Under Cyaxares, who ruled in the late 7th century BCE, the Median kingdom reached its greatest extent and influence. Cyaxares reorganized the Median military, moving away from tribal levies toward a more structured fighting force organized by weapon type, spearmen, archers, and cavalry forming distinct units. This military innovation made the Median army a formidable force, capable of challenging the established powers of the region. The geopolitical situation of the time created opportunities for ambitious rulers. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Middle East for centuries, was straining under internal pressures and external threats. Cyaxares recognized that the moment had come to act decisively. Forming an alliance with Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Dynasty, the Medes joined in the campaign against Assyria that would culminate in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. The alliance between the Medes and Babylonians proved tremendously effective. While Babylonian forces attacked from the south, Median armies struck from the east and north, converging on the Assyrian Heartland. The fall of the great Assyrian cities marked a turning point in ancient Middle Eastern history, and the Medes emerged from the conflict, controlling vast territories in the north and east. Following Assyria's collapse, the Median Kingdom and Babylonian Empire divided much of the former Assyrian territory between them. The Medes gained control over Assyria itself and expanded their influence into Anatolia while maintaining their Iranian heartland. This arrangement established a balance of power in the region, with the two allies respecting each other's spheres of influence. The Medes continued to expand westward into Anatolia, bringing them into conflict with the Kingdom of Lydia in what is now Western Turkey. The war between the Medes and Lydians produced one of history's most remarkable moments. According to accounts from the period, a battle between the two armies on May 28, 585 BCE, was interrupted by a total solar eclipse. The sudden darkness was interpreted as a divine omen, and both sides agreed to cease fighting. A peace treaty was negotiated, establishing the Halys River as the boundary between the two kingdoms. Median culture left its mark on the region in ways that would endure long after their kingdom's independence ended. They developed sophisticated metalworking techniques, creating beautiful bronze and gold objects decorated with animal motifs. Their artistic style, blending elements from various cultural traditions of the Iranian plateau, influenced subsequent Persian art. The Medes also contributed to the development of Zoroastrianism, the religious tradition that would become central to later Persian civilization, though the exact nature of early Median religious practices remains a subject of scholarly investigation. The Median aristocracy developed a distinct cultural identity, with their own styles of dress, customs, and court ceremonies that impressed foreign visitors and neighbors. Greek sources describe elaborate royal protocols and the careful organization of court life, elements that would be adopted and adapted by their Persian successors. The Medes were skilled horsemen, and their cavalry tactics influenced military practices throughout the region. As the 6th century BCE progressed, the Median kingdom stood as one of the great powers of the ancient world, controlling territories from central Iran to eastern Anatolia. Their capital at Ecbatana served as a major center where trade routes converged, bringing goods and ideas from across a vast area. The kingdom had achieved a remarkable transformation from scattered tribal groups to an organized state capable of destroying the mighty Assyrian Empire. Yet even as Median power seemed secure, changes were already taking shape within the broader Iranian world. In the southern region of Persis, modern Fars province in Iran, another Iranian people were building their strength under their own dynasty. These Persians acknowledged Median overlordship, but they were developing their own ambitions and capabilities, preparing for the moment when they would step onto the stage of ancient Middle Eastern history and transform the entire region in ways the world had never seen before. The Median kingdom to the east had helped bring down the mighty Assyrian Empire, but within a generation, a new power was stirring in the highlands of southern Iran. In the region known as Persis, or what we now call Fars province, a people called the Persians had long dwelt in the shadow of their Median overlords. They spoke a related language, worshipped similar deities, and shared many customs, yet they remained distinct. Around 559 BCE, a young man named Cyrus ascended to rule over the Persian tribes of Anshan, and with his coming, the entire landscape of the ancient Middle East would transform in ways no one could have anticipated. The chronicles tell us that Cyrus possessed remarkable qualities that set him apart from other rulers of his age. Where many kings of that era relied solely on force and intimidation, Cyrus seemed to understand something more subtle about the nature of power. He combined military skill with an unusual talent for winning loyalty, for making former enemies into allies, for transforming conquest into cooperation. The ancient writers, even those from lands he conquered, spoke of him with admiration rather than the usual fear and resentment reserved for foreign rulers. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus made his move against Astyages, the king of the Medes who ruled over the Persians as vassals. The details have been embroidered by later storytellers with tales of prophecies and family intrigue, but the essential fact remains clear. When Cyrus marched against his overlord, something unexpected happened. The Median nobles, perhaps dissatisfied with Astyages, perhaps drawn to Cyrus himself, switched their allegiance. The Median army simply melted away or joined the Persian cause, and Astyages found himself handed over to his former vassal. Rather than a bloody struggle, the transfer of power came almost peacefully, and Cyrus treated the conquered Median king with respect rather than cruelty. This pattern would repeat itself throughout Cyrus's reign. He seemed to grasp that empires built on terror alone eventually crumbled, but empires that offered something more than mere subjugation could endure. When he took control of the Median kingdom, he did not destroy their capital at Ecbatana, but made it one of his own royal centers. He incorporated Median nobles into his administration, blended Median and Persian traditions, and presented himself as the legitimate successor to Median power rather than merely its destroyer. With the resources of both Persia and Media at his command, Cyrus turned his attention westward toward the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in what is now western Turkey. King Croesus of Lydia had been alarmed by the sudden rise of Persian power and sought to check it before it grew too strong. The two forces met somewhere in central Anatolia around 547 BCE. When the first battles proved inconclusive, Croesus withdrew to his capital at Sardis for the winter, assuming that military campaigns, as was customary, would resume in spring. But Cyrus did not follow custom. He pressed forward through the winter, caught the Lydian army unprepared, and besieged Sardis itself. When Sardis fell after a brief siege, Cyrus again displayed the quality that made him different from other conquerors. He spared Croesus's life and reportedly kept the former king as an advisor. He took control of Lydia's legendary wealth, the gold that had allowed the Lydians to mint some of the world's first coins, but he did not devastate the land or scatter its people. The Greek cities along the Aegean coast, which had been under Lydian influence, now found themselves facing Persian power, beginning a relationship that would shape Mediterranean history for centuries to come. With western Anatolia secured, Cyrus turned his attention to the greatest prize of all, the ancient city of Babylon. By this time, in the mid-6th century BCE, Babylon was ruled by a king named Nabonidus, whose religious policies had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. Nabonidus had shown preference for the moon god Sin and had spent years away from Babylon at the desert oasis of Tamar, leaving his son Belshazzar to manage the city. The priests and people of Babylon had grown restless under this unusual rule. When Cyrus's forces approached Babylon in 539 BCE, they found a city divided against itself. The ancient records, including Cyrus's own cylinder inscription discovered by archaeologists, tell us that Babylon opened its gates with little resistance. The priests of Marduk welcomed Cyrus as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Cyrus entered the city peacefully, and according to the cylinder inscription, he proclaimed himself chosen by Marduk to restore proper order to Babylon. He claimed to have entered the city without battle, bringing peace to its inhabitants. What Cyrus did next would establish his reputation across the centuries. Rather than imposing Persian religious practices on Babylon, he honored the Babylonian gods. He restored temples, returned sacred images to their proper shrines, and presented himself as a traditional Mesopotamian king rather than a foreign invader. More remarkably still, he issued a proclamation allowing peoples who had been displaced and held in Babylon to return to their homelands and rebuild their sanctuaries. Among those who benefited from this policy were communities who had been brought to Babylon decades earlier by Nebuchadnezzar. The Persian king's decree allowed them to return to their ancestral lands in the Levant and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, an act that would be remembered with profound gratitude in their sacred writings. This was not merely generosity, but shrewd policy. Cyrus understood that grateful, autonomous communities, free to worship their own gods, made more loyal subjects than resentful captives nursing dreams of rebellion. Within a single generation, Cyrus had created something unprecedented in the ancient Middle East. His empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, encompassing all the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, Anatolia, and beyond. Yet it was an empire built not just on military conquest, but on a vision of governance that respected local traditions, honored local gods, and allowed diverse peoples to maintain their identities while accepting Persian overlordship. The administrative structure Cyrus began to establish would be refined by his successors, but its foundations were laid during his reign. He recognized that such a vast territory could not be ruled from a single center, so he established regional governors while maintaining overall Persian control. He kept the great capitals at Ecbatana, Babylon, and his new constructions in the Persian Heartland, moving between them with the seasons. When Cyrus died around 530 BCE, reportedly in battle on his empire's northeastern frontier, he left behind something extraordinary. In just 3 decades, he had transformed the political map of the ancient world and created an empire that would endure for over 2 centuries. The warmth of the evening sun on the stone walls of Persepolis, yet to be built, already seemed to beckon as his son Cambyses prepared to add Egypt to the growing Persian realm, and as the systems of administration, the roads, the couriers, and the vision of diverse peoples united under enlightened rule continued to take shape across the lands that had witnessed the very dawn of civilization. The Persian Empire that Cyrus had founded and Cambyses had expanded now passed into the hands of a ruler who would bring it to unprecedented heights of power and organizational brilliance. Darius I, who came to the throne in 522 BCE, possessed not only military skill, but also an extraordinary talent for administration and governance. Under his steady hand, the vast territories stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River would be woven together into a functioning whole, a testament to human ingenuity in managing diversity and distance. Darius understood that ruling such an enormous empire required more than military might. He needed systems that could carry information across thousands of miles, collect taxes fairly from dozens of different peoples, and maintain order without crushing local traditions. The solution he devised was the satrapy system, dividing the empire into approximately 20 provinces, each governed by a satrap who served as the king's representative. These satraps held significant power in their regions, overseeing tax collection, maintaining order, and commanding local military forces. Yet Darius ensured they never became too independent. He sent royal inspectors, known as the eyes and ears of the king, to visit each province, reporting directly to him about conditions and the conduct of his governors. To bind this sprawling realm together, Darius invested heavily in infrastructure that would have astonished earlier Mesopotamian rulers. The Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Persia, became the empire's central artery. Along its length, stations were established at regular intervals where royal messengers could change horses, allowing urgent communications to travel the entire distance in just 7 days, a remarkable achievement in an age when most travelers measured journeys in months. Ordinary merchants and travelers also used this road, benefiting from the relative safety that Persian authority provided. Caravanserais offered shelter and provisions, and the movement of goods and ideas along these routes enriched the entire empire. Darius also recognized the importance of standardization in facilitating trade and administration. He introduced a standardized coinage system, with the gold daric becoming recognized across the empire and beyond. Merchants from Egypt to India could now conduct business with greater ease, knowing that Persian coins held reliable value. This monetary system, combined with improved roads and security, stimulated commerce throughout the realm, bringing prosperity that helped maintain stability and loyalty to Persian rule. The king's building projects reflected both his ambition and the resources at his command. At Persepolis, in the heartland of Persia, Darius constructed a ceremonial capital that would serve as the stage for the empire's most important rituals. The great platform, carved partly from the mountain itself, supported magnificent audience halls and palaces decorated with intricate stone reliefs. These carvings depicted representatives from all the empire's peoples bringing tribute to the king, a visual representation of the world's diversity united under Persian authority. The craftsmanship displayed at Persepolis drew upon skills from across the empire: Babylonian brickworkers, Greek sculptors, Egyptian stonecutters, all contributing their expertise to create something that transcended any single tradition. The administrative center at Susa hummed with the daily business of empire. Here, in halls lined with glazed bricks showing lions and mythical beasts, scribes worked in multiple languages. The Persian chancellery employed writers skilled in Aramaic, Elamite, Babylonian, and other tongues, for Darius understood that effective governance required communicating with subjects in their own languages. Tablets and parchments flowed in and out of Susa, carrying tax records, legal disputes, construction orders, and diplomatic correspondence across distances that would have seemed impossible to manage just centuries earlier. Darius also concerned himself with the spiritual welfare of his empire. While he personally followed the teachings associated with the prophet Zoroaster, worshipping Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity, he continued the Persian policy of religious tolerance. In Egypt, he supported traditional temples and presented himself as a pharaoh chosen by Egyptian gods. In Babylon, he made offerings at the Temple of Marduk and claimed legitimacy through Mesopotamian traditions. This flexibility allowed diverse peoples to accept Persian rule without feeling their deepest beliefs were threatened. The empire's prosperity rested partly on its enlightened approach to water management and agriculture. Persian engineers, drawing on millennia of Mesopotamian irrigation expertise, developed underground channels called qanats that brought water from mountain sources to distant fields without excessive evaporation. These systems, some stretching many miles underground, allowed agriculture to flourish in regions that might otherwise have remained barren. The careful management of water resources, that ancient concern that had occupied Sumerian farmers 4,000 years earlier, remained central to civilization's success. As Darius looked out from his palace terraces across the ordered gardens and productive lands of Persia, he could reflect on what the ancient Middle East had achieved. From the first farmers who had settled along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, through the scribes who had invented writing on clay tablets, to the lawgivers and temple builders, the astronomers and merchants, this region had pioneered so many of humanity's defining advances. The cities that had risen here, Uruk and Babylon and Nineveh, Susa and Persepolis, had demonstrated that humans could create complex societies, govern themselves through law, preserve knowledge across generations, and imagine futures different from the present. The legacy of these ancient civilizations would ripple outward through time in ways their creators could hardly have imagined. The alphabet that scribes in the Levant had simplified from earlier scripts would carry knowledge to distant shores. The mathematical insights of Babylonian astronomers would influence understanding of the heavens for millennia. The legal principles carved into Hammurabi's stone would echo through later codes of law. The epic poetry of Gilgamesh would inspire storytellers who had never seen Mesopotamia. The architectural ambitions embodied in ziggurats and palace complexes would challenge future builders to reach ever higher. As night falls over Persepolis, over the ancient cities along the rivers, over the routes that caravans have traveled for thousands of years, we can rest knowing that the foundations laid here, in writing and law, in agriculture and architecture, in the very concept of civilization itself, continue to support the structures of human society. The ingenuity and persistence of countless generations, working the soil, shaping the clay, reading the stars, and building communities, created something enduring in this cradle of civilization. Their achievements invite us to sleep peacefully, knowing that we too are part of this long human story, inheritors of ancient wisdom and contributors to a future they helped make possible. As we bring to a close our journey through the ancient Middle East, from the first clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the vast Persian empires that stretched across the horizon, we hope these stories of humanity's earliest civilizations have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration of the cradle of civilization. If these calm adventures through ancient cities and timeless lands have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers find their way here. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles into rest, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.